Did you know? Prior to working on the Golden Sun series, developer Camelot made several other RPGs. Most famously, they heavily impacted the Shining Force series. Camelot would go on to develop another RPG called Beyond the Beyond for the original PlayStation. While it was notable at the time for being the first traditional Japanese RPG available for the PS1 in the West, it was widely panned upon release. Reviewers criticized the game's length, pacing, difficulty, and overabundance of random encounters. Despite this, Beyond the Beyond was something of a spiritual predecessor to Golden Sun. Several features that made Golden Sun a rousing success, such as its combat and the pseudo 3D battle screens, made their first appearance in Beyond the Beyond. Golden Sun had a very long development cycle for a Game Boy Advance title, being in production for almost 18 months. By comparison, handheld games at the time were generally expected to be completed in under a year. The extended length of the project was mostly due to Golden Sun and its sequel, The Lost Age, originally being planned as one game. It was ultimately split into 2 installments because the combined size would have been too big for a single Game Boy Advance cartridge to hold. In order to justify splitting the story in half, The Lost Age was made to follow characters who were the antagonists in the first game, a concept the studio had utilized before. In an interview on Nintendo World Report, Hiroyuki Takahashi and his brother Shugo Takahashi stated, "Originally we had made a game called Shining Force 3, and it was popular here in the United States. In that game you had the ability to play as both good side and the bad side, and that seemed to be a really nice way for the players to understand the entire setting and a good way to convey information in the story. And so when we were doing Golden Sun, we again thought, well, we could expand upon that." Golden Sun's initial design documents outlined it as a Nintendo 64 game. Development started very late in the N64's life cycle, however, and the project was moved over to the Game Boy Advance. This actually helped the game in the end, as it released very early in the Game Boy Advance's life and became the first major RPG hit on the system. Conversely, the third game in the series, Dark Dawn, was released late in the DS's life, 7 years after the release of The Lost Age. The long wait for a sequel was a source of much frustration for fans, even prompting some to make hoaxes of a potential third installment. The most circulated of these was called Golden Sun: The Solar Soothsayer. According to an online post, the Solar Soothsayer was a DS game announced at a small pre-E3 event complete with screenshots supposedly taken on a cell phone. The rumor ran rampant for some time, but the screenshots were eventually proven false as they reused promotional artwork for The Lost Age. The creator of the hoax, a forum user who went by the name Opium, later came forward and explained that he'd created the hoax to generate a discussion about a new Golden Sun game. While Hiroyuki Takahashi learned about the hoax during an interview with Engadget, he was enthusiastic about it, remarking, "The Solar Soothsayer sounds really cool. I wonder how the story would go. I want to see how it would turn out." Even though Dark Dawn took 7 years to come out, Camelot intended to work on a third Golden Sun shortly after The Lost Age. The project had to be put on hold as the team were busy working on the Mario Tennis and Mario Golf games. After this, several employees left Camelot, and the Takahashi brothers thought their new staff weren't ready to tackle development of such a large-scale game. In an interview posted on Camelot's Japanese website, Hiroyuki Takahashi said the idea to make a new Golden Sun game for the DS came to him after drinking a lot of liquor at a party. Since Dark Dawn was being made for the DS, the team naturally wanted to take advantage of the system's features and toyed with the idea of playing the game using only the touchscreen. Golden Sun featured a system that allowed players to carry over their save data into The Lost Age, either by way of a 260-character password or by using the Game Link cable. To many players' dismay, Dark Dawn didn't include any kind of data transfer system. According to Takahashi, they decided not to include it because Dark Dawn took place 30 years after The Lost Age, so there wouldn't have been much benefit to transferring the save data anyway. There are some interesting unused assets and secrets in the Golden Sun series. Hidden in the code for the first 2 games is an alternate character portrait for Alex. What's interesting is that the image is located in the same area reserved for the portraits of playable characters, suggesting Alex was intended to join the player's party at some point. There's also an unused NPC sprite for the character resembling Link from The Legend of Zelda in the data for The Lost Age. The sprite's intended purpose is unknown, but it's thought to be simply a nod to the Zelda franchise. When starting a new file in the original Golden Sun, the player will be given the option to change the name of Isaac, the main character. If the select button is pressed 3 times on the name input screen, the player will also be given the option to rename the other party members, Garrett, Ivan, and Mia. On Mia's name input screen, if the player presses up, down, left, right, up, right, down, left, up, then select, they can also change the names of Jenna, Felix, and Sheba. It's also possible to get a secret bad ending in the first game. Early on, the Great Healer will ask the player if they will accept responsibility for the fate of the land. If the player answers no and leaves the room, the screen will turn gray and a message will appear saying, "And so the world began drifting toward its fated destruction." The TV commercial for the first Golden Sun is famous for having absolutely nothing to do with the game. Dark Dawn referenced this by including the Chandelier Dragon from the commercial as a new summon. Camelot also referenced some of their older games. In The Lost Age, there's an injured shopkeeper behind the item shop in Madra. Casting Mind Read on her triggers the text, "Eyes, shining in the darkness. No, go away." Shining in the Darkness is the first title developed by Camelot and the first entry in the Shining Force series. Shining Force featured the character Dark Soul as the game's antagonist. In The Lost Age, the final boss, Doom Dragon, has an attack named Dark Soul Grasp. The future of Golden Sun is uncertain, and Hiroyuki Takahashi said that whether Camelot makes a fourth game depends on how much fan demand there is.
Did you know? Advance Wars is actually the 5th entry in a series generally referred to as Nintendo Wars. The first game in the series was Famicom Wars, followed by Game Boy Wars 1, 2, and 3, as well as Super Famicom Wars. A faster-paced Turbo edition of Game Boy Wars was also made with more levels, though this is largely considered the same game. Although the Wars series had stayed in Japan up to this point, Advance Wars was lucky to see a release in Japan at all. The game was one of several projects Nintendo made as part of their lineup of launch titles for the Game Boy Advance, but they were stretching themselves thin. In order to help alleviate their workload, Nintendo asked Intelligent Systems to aid with development of Advance Wars. At the time, the team was told that turn-based games weren't popular outside of Japan due to their complicated nature. Early on, members of Intelligent Systems would get together and discuss new ideas for the game, but these ideas were almost always shot down by Nintendo for being too sophisticated and unsuitable for a casual audience. In response, the team worked to make the title simpler and easier to understand. One way they did this was by adding a detailed tutorial so players wouldn't have to read the game manual before playing. Members of the team also incorporated elements from their own favorite game genres into Advance Wars. For example, the precision of movement when controlling units was inspired by shooter games, and rhythm games like Beatmania helped to add a rhythm to the way the game is played. When Nintendo of America's marketing team got a chance to try Advance Wars, they loved it and decided the game was suitable for a full international release. The game received critical acclaim in North America and may have helped change Nintendo's view of the Western market. Kentaro Nishimura, one of the game's designers, cited the success of Advance Wars as a key reason why Nintendo eventually released Fire Emblem outside of Japan. Since the games had a similar playstyle, Nintendo thought the American Game Boy Advance audience had been primed for Fire Emblem. This seems fitting, as Fire Emblem only exists at all thanks to the original Famicom Wars, with the first Fire Emblem using the Famicom Wars engine. Advance Wars was launched in North America first, with releases planned for Japan and Europe shortly after. Ironically, despite originally being planned as a Japan-only title, Advance Wars actually ended up being cancelled in Japan. One explanation for this is that the game's original Japanese release date was October 12, 2001, just 1 month after the September 11th terrorist attacks in the United States. An alternate theory is that the game was pushed back due to the release of Game Boy Wars 3, which came out in August of 2001. It's possible Nintendo didn't want their own games competing with each other and delayed Advance Wars to give Game Boy Wars 3 a fighting chance. Due to Advance Wars being cancelled, the game's sequel, Advance Wars 2 Black Hole Rising, was also cancelled in Japan despite both games being developed in the country. The games finally saw a Japanese release in the form of a 2-in-1 compilation cartridge in 2004, prior to the release of Advance Wars Dual Strike on the Nintendo DS. However, cancellations would continue to plague the series in Japan. The next installment, Advance Wars Days of Ruin, was released internationally in 2008, but was ultimately cancelled in Japan following a series of delays. Interestingly, the international versions of Days of Ruin contain a full Japanese translation in their data, though it's only available through hacking. This seems to indicate that the Japanese version of the game was fully completed and ready for release well before it was cancelled. Days of Ruin would eventually become available in Japan in 2013 as a downloadable title for members of the Club Nintendo Reward program. Although many Advance Wars titles released in Japan after the West, the Japanese game seems to serve as the base for all titles. After both versions of Advance Wars released, gamers saw several notable differences between the two versions. Most of the game's commanding officers had their names changed in the West, and some were even given redesigns. Nell was originally named Catherine and wore a sleeveless top with a shorter skirt. Drake was named Mop and seemed more like a traditional pirate. Sanja, originally called Asuka, wore glasses instead of a hat, and her uniform was changed from red to green. And Grit was called Billy and wore a cowboy hat. The most drastic changes were made to Olaf, who was originally named Whip and had a white beard and a Santa hat, and Kanbei, who was called Kikuchiyo and wore samurai armor in the Japanese game. Other differences from the Japanese version include the term Shogun being changed to Commanding Officer, and the Red Star Army being renamed to Orange Star. This subtle change in color was possibly to avoid direct comparisons to communist regimes. In Advance Wars 2, many of the visual changes to commanding officers were at least partially incorporated into the Japanese designs, leading to fewer differences between officers in both releases. In Japan, Advance Wars 1 and 2 are known as Game Boy Wars Advance 1 and 2. Although the Advance Wars name was kept for the DS games Dual Strike and Days of Ruin in the West, both titles adopted the leading title Famicom Wars DS in Japan. Days of Ruin had a notable tonal shift for the series, having a somewhat more realistic and gritty art style. According to one of the game's English localizers, Tim O'Leary, the change was made due to some fans saying the series was becoming repetitive and predictable. Interestingly, the shift was also influenced by sales data. Although it began as a Japan-only franchise, Advance Wars had become much more popular in North America than in Japan. As such, Intelligent Systems altered the game's tone in an attempt to cater to Westerners. Intelligent Systems also felt that the new style fit better with Days of Ruin's near-future sci-fi setting. There are several unique secrets and Easter eggs hidden in the Advance Wars series. In the first game's tutorial level, Copter Tactics, the player is instructed to win by capturing the enemy's headquarters. If the player instead wins by routing the enemy, it triggers an alternate dialogue from Nell where she congratulates the player for their work. Conversely, in the first tutorial level of Advance Wars 2, if the player somehow manages to run out of fuel, Nell will scold Andy for goofing around and tell him to forfeit the level. In the map editor mode of Advance Wars 2, if the player repeatedly attempts to place a unit on an illegal square at least 50 times in a row, it'll cause Nell to interject with a snarky comment, saying, "You must really like doing that over and over again. Keep it up." If the player holds down the L and R buttons while selecting the map editor, the game will load a special bonus map that spells out Nintendo in kanji. This same map appears in both Advance Wars 1 and 2. Dual Strike also includes a new bonus map featuring the name of the series itself, which was even translated for the English release. Another interesting fact about Advance Wars is that practically all of the weapons and vehicles in the game are based on real devices. For example, the Orange Star Mechanized Infantry is inspired by the American M20A1/A1B1 Super Bazooka, and the Blue Moon Mech unit is based on the Russian RPG-7 rocket launcher. The Orange Star fighter jets also resemble the American F-15 Eagle, while the Blue Moon jet seems to be based on the French Dassault Mirage 3. The original Advance Wars also contains a bizarre glitch involving the map editor. To trigger the glitch, the player must first play the level Naval Forces and lose by allowing the enemy to destroy their T-copter, then go to the map editor. By placing one unit and then deleting it, the game will respond as though the player's forces have been wiped out. If the player then exits the editor using the in-game menu rather than the map editor menu, the map editor's features will be available to use anywhere in the game. This glitch has several practical applications. First and foremost, it can be used to delete enemy units during a normal level, allowing the player to easily bypass any mission in the game. Additionally, the glitch can also be used to save the campaign maps as custom maps, which allows the player to use custom maps that are smaller than the default size of 30 by 20 tiles. The War series was also planned to appear on the Nintendo 64. In 1999, Nintendo announced a new entry in the series to be released for the Nintendo 64, dubbed 64 Wars or Advance Wars 64 by fans. The game was being developed by Hudson Soft rather than series creators Intelligent Systems. Hudson likely got this opportunity because of their work on Game Boy Wars Turbo and Game Boy Wars 2. Much like previous titles, the gameplay of 64 Wars would involve players controlling units on a 2D grid. However, the game would transition to 3D graphics to illustrate key moments in battle, as well as combat between units. 64 Wars was also going to feature connectivity with Game Boy Wars 2 via the Nintendo 64 Transfer Pack. According to promotional material, players could start playing a level on their Nintendo 64 and then transfer the game to their Game Boy to continue playing on the go. They could even transfer it back to the N64 to finish the level. Sadly, 64 Wars was a short-lived project and was only ever shown in a few magazine ads and previewed at Nintendo's Space World event in 1999. No reason was given for the game's cancellation, but Hudson did go on to make a third Game Boy Wars game. The series would eventually make it to the GameCube in the form of Battalion Wars 1 and 2. Although these entries have completely different gameplay and are considered a sub-series, they were originally announced under the title Advance Wars Under Fire and are known as Assault Famicom Wars Versus in Japan. The Advance Wars name was dropped in the West so that players didn't expect the game to play like a typical Wars game.
We've covered numerous RPGs on Region Locked. Often, these games remain in Japan because they're a brand new IP that perhaps hasn't garnered the audience, or possibly the translation effort alone would be too much of an undertaking to bring it westward. However, in this video, we're covering the sequel to the now beloved cult classic RPG, Earthbound. Finally, we're talking about Mother 3. Developed by Nintendo subsidiaries HAL Labs and Brownie Brown, now known as 1UP Studios, Mother 3 released for the Game Boy Advance on April 20th, 2006. Mother 3 takes place sometime after the events of Earthbound. The game's story spans multiple characters, each with their own plot, and a variety of them joining the party only temporarily. The main focus of the title is Lucas, beginning when he is just a young child in Tasmili, a small village located in the Nowhere Islands, which doesn't have any form of currency. The villagers are all happy and work together to provide for one another. Twins Lucas and Klaus go with their mother, Hinawa, to visit her father in the mountains outside of the village. While there, the boys spend their time playing with the wildlife, Dragos, small dinosaur-like creatures. It doesn't take long for aliens wearing pig masks to appear and begin throwing explosives and setting fires in the forest. The boy's father, Flint, helps to protect the village and its inhabitants. Rain extinguishes the fire, and it's at this point that Flint finds out that his family are yet to return from the mountains. Flint sets out to find his wife and children, and the villagers split up, working together to find them. In the mountains, Flint comes across pigmen, creating bizarre creatures, amalgamations of both organic and robotic material. He finds their notebook, revealing that they think animals suck, and that they want to make them tougher and rougher. Flint then finds his children have been discovered by the villagers, who are keeping them warm by a fire after they fell into the river and had been washed ashore. After a short rest, a villager runs to Flint, informing him that his wife has passed away. She had been found with a Drago fang having pierced her heart. Flint, distraught and unable to contain his rage, grabs a log from out of the fire pit. Lashing out in front of his children, frightening them and the villagers, he attacks several citizens of Tasmili before being knocked unconscious. When Flint awakens, he finds himself in prison for his violent crimes, being the first person to ever be sent to the prison in Tasmili village. After Klaus breaks him out with a nail file hidden inside an apple, he sets out to find his wife's grave. There, he finds an emotional Lucas, who reveals that Klaus has gone to seek revenge against the Drago. On his journey to find Klaus, Flint meets the Magypsies, a collection of people who have been hidden from the world for a long time. They are neither human nor animal, man nor woman, capable of gifting people with psychic powers. They reveal that they have assisted Klaus, providing him with a powerful psionic attack, and have set him on his way. Flint finds the Drago that killed his wife, and after a fierce battle with the creature, he refrains from killing it for the sake of its child. Flint, however, did not end up finding Klaus. These events set the adventure in motion, not with a triumphant victory, but rather a tragedy of anger and death. The game follows the same gameplay as Earthbound for the most part, with the addition of hot springs throughout the world to recover health, and saving being facilitated by speaking with frogs. A new feature of Mother 3 over earlier releases in the series is the inclusion of being able to perform combos during combat. When performing a standard melee attack, the player can attack an enemy multiple times by pressing the A button in time with the rhythm of a battle's background music, which differs between enemies. The player is able to attack up to a total of 16 times through this system, and if they are unable to determine the music's beat, they can put an enemy to sleep to make the beat more distinct over the melody. Series creator Shigesato Itoi had plans for a third entry in the Mother series as early as 1992, something he recalled in an interview with Famitsu that year. "I thought of it in the middle of the night. It was enough to make me rush and call my friend about it. Plus, there's sort of a hint to it in Mother 2. I can't name any specifics because it's about the next game, but we're doing a CD-ROM for the Super Famicom." The sequel to Earthbound was first announced to the public in 1996, with the project being developed for the Nintendo 64. It did not take long for work to shift from the Nintendo 64 to the disk drive expansion, the Nintendo 64 DD. It was expected for the game to launch alongside the DD, but because of the team's lack of experience working with 3D and the new hardware, the title was continually delayed. 4 years after being announced, the game was cancelled in August of 2000. Satoru Iwata claimed the game was 30% done, while Shigeru Miyamoto said that it was about 60% finished, but neither wanted to release the game without it being 100% completed. The game was a huge undertaking for the N64DD. In a discussion with Itoi, Miyamoto, and Iwata, the group divulged their extensive plans for the game. It's an RPG with 12 chapters, so each person has a different playing experience, something I'd never do now. But at the time, my ambitions were really out there, so I had ideas for how to run each chapter. I'd have one chapter work as a normal RPG, another chapter of just cutscenes, and another one with a game that had overlapping timelines, having 3 of the chapters made completely of still images and text to act as transitions. More information was slowly released as the game was being produced. It was planned to have more than 10 playable characters, each used for different chapters, with some main characters returning in other chapters as side characters for the party. The game was hoping to achieve a unique playing experience for each player. For example, a character could plant a seed in an earlier chapter and then find it has grown into a tree in a later one, helping them reach the top of a cliff, whereas another player might find an alternate path. A player might drop some food from their inventory in a certain location, which would then later attract enemies. The game was hoping to use the 64DD's internal clock, having night and day reflect what was happening in real time. A demo of the game was showcased at the Nintendo-sponsored Space World 1999 event, under the name Mother 3: The End of the Pig King. It contained playable sections in which the player took control of Flint, such as navigating a desert canyon, engaging in classic turn-based battles, riding a pork bean, exploring a snake-filled dungeon, and a town in which the player can interact with townsfolk. Several cutscenes were also shown, including footage of a band playing a song, Boney the dog running through rain, a character riding a dragon next to a bullet train, and a minecart scene with Lucas and Klaus speeding through caves and dungeons. IGN claimed this scene was clearly the visually most impressive sequence. Iwata blamed himself for the first cancellation of Mother 3. He said he wasn't available through much of Mother 3's production and spent a total of 3 months going back and forth to America. Both Miyamoto and Iwata claimed that the start of production for Mother 3 was unusual due to a lack of the trial period normal games go through by prototyping a rough version. Believing that the team from Earthbound would just transfer across all of their knowledge from the previous game's development, they jumped straight into the project, requiring new staff to be brought in to work on the game that hadn't had experience from the previous title. With these extra people on board, HAL Laboratories had to produce more games to have the funds to pay their staff. In the same interview, Iwata said that when creating Earthbound, the team managed to break past any proposed limitations the SNES had. The same mentality was carried forward to the N64 when creating Mother 3. This meant the production got out of hand, and with Iwata not on site for a lot of the production, when he returned, he spent 9 months going over what had already been produced, rather than progressing with the development. Iwata was even hospitalized at one point from overwork and stress on the project. Different measures were taken to try and get the game released for Christmas 1999, including bringing on some of the staff that had worked on Pokémon Stadium. The team tried to get the game down from 12 chapters to just 7, but this still did not help. The date of release was moved to the following Christmas. However, by August 2000, the decision had to be made as to whether to sacrifice all of the other games that HAL had in the pipeline, or to simply just cancel Mother 3. Though it seemed like Mother 3 would never be completed, Miyamoto, on the day of cancellation, was already contemplating what format Mother 3 could take instead, such as being adapted into a film or book. He even proposed shifting development over to the Game Boy Advance, though this idea was shot down by several other producers. However, this idea came to fruition 3 years later in 2003, when brought back to life with the team going back to working with 2D graphics on the Game Boy Advance. The main inspiration for Mother 3 was La Grande Cahier, or The Notebook in the West, by Agatha Christoph. It's the first book in a trilogy about twins surviving in World War II. Itoi claimed in an interview with MyCom Inc., "It's similar to an RPG, and it has an incredible presence." Lucas and Klaus, the protagonist twins from Mother 3, are named after the twins in the book. Itoi also claimed in an interview with Nintendo Dream magazine that the David Lynch TV show, Twin Peaks, and J.J. Abrams' Lost, which he was watching at the time, were the main inspiration for Tane Island. It was his intention for the island to reflect the player's worst nightmare, and the temporary dialogue which was used during development was so unpleasant that he had to rewrite it in order to tone it down. What started off as a glitch during development actually ended up being used. When Mr. Saturn gives the player the Franklin badge and leaves, bidding farewell, he ends up sitting only slightly off-screen. While this was not done intentionally, Itoi found it to be amusing, and so wrote dialogue for him and kept it in. There's also a large volume of unused content in Mother 3's data, including a favorite food item which would heal a party member for 300 HP. A bizarre unused image of the Summit Inn Cafe that is located on Route 66 in California can also be found in the game. It's assumed that this was to test the GBA's graphical capabilities, but some have speculated that it may have been the inspiration for the Dirty Cafe in Chapter 5. The game is littered with many references to music, so much so that we can't list them all, but here are just a few. The song Mr. Batty Twist is a clear reference to the Batman theme. And Enter the Pig Masks has a similar tune to a section of the Godzilla theme. There are also multiple references to classical music. The track Lieder Gymnopédie is a cover of Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1. And Ode to Ancestors' 8th movement is a medley of various tracks composed by Bach, Vivaldi, and Handel. The enemy, Gently Weeping Guitar, is a reference to the Beatles track While My Guitar Gently Weeps. The 7 Magypsies, a tribe of humanoids who guard the 7 needles, were named by the game's composer, Shogo Sakai, with each one a reference to the 7 modes in music. Ionia is Ionian, Doria is Dorian, Phrygia is Phrygian, Lydia is Lydian, Mixolydia is Mixolydian, Aeolia is Aeolian, and Locria is Locrian. The GBA contains a CPU dedicated to playing Game Boy and Game Boy Color titles on the Game Boy Advance, which Mother 3 uses in order to play 2 tracks in the game, an 8-bit variation of No Eating Crackers in the Cinema and Porky's Porkies. There were actually 2 music albums released for the game in Japan, Mother 3 Plus and Mother 3i, as well as a digital release on iTunes in North America, though it has since been removed from the store. Mother 3 Plus released on November 2nd, 2006, and contained music from Mother 3, as well as some tracks from the original Mother and Earthbound. The album was composed by DCMC, also known as the Crazy Ken Band. Lyrics were added to the game's main theme, We Miss You, Love Theme, performed by Taeko Onaki. The song was created late into Mother 3's development in December 2005, just 4 months before the game was released. The Pigs theme was originally considered as the game's main track. Itoi requested a more emotional piece be used for a crucial scene towards the end of the game in order to give a greater impact, and wanted the track to be simple enough to be played with just one finger. Much like 8 melodies from the first Mother, which ended up in school music textbooks for children to play, he envisioned the same thing happening with the love theme from Mother 3. Mother 3 Plus was number 1 in Japan's Oricon indie chart on November 13, 2006, and was 26th in the soundtrack chart for 3 weeks. The CD was also originally released with a Mr. Saturn mobile strap. Mother 3i was released just a few months later on February 6, 2007, and was composed by Shogo Sakai. It contained different tracks to those found on Mother 3 Plus, but across both albums, not all of the staggering 250 tracks featured in the game have been commercially released. While Mother 3 never saw release in the West, both Lucas and Klaus appear in Super Smash Bros. From Brawl onwards. Lucas was initially intended to replace Ness in Melee, but Sakurai decided against this after the continuous delays. Their appearance in the Smash series makes them the only playable characters to be from a game not released outside of Japan. Despite the online presence and popularity of Mother 3, Nintendo has continually teased the idea of the game receiving localization, but never committed. The reasons behind this decision have never been made fully clear, and so fans have made a number of assumptions as to why this might be. Above all else, people look to sales of the earlier released Earthbound on SNES. The game was notorious for its advertising, which many blame for its lackluster sales, as well as the fact that it was released while focus was moving away from the SNES. Despite this, the game has a strong Western following, and has shown reasonable sales through digital re-releases. Mother 3 was also created for the Game Boy Advance at a time when Nintendo had begun to focus on their newest handheld, the Nintendo DS. During 2006, several games were published by Nintendo for the GBA in Japan, but only 2 other titles were released in the US, Pokémon Mystery Dungeon and Game Freak's Drill Dozer. As well as this, some themes and scenes in the game would likely require altering for any sort of official release, but this might be an issue considering they are integral to the game's plot. A number of controversial subjects play central roles in the game, including the acceptance of death, animal abuse, and scenes of violence. Some important sections of the game also make reference to drug use, as well as a portion of the game that displays male-on-male kissing. A fan translation was created by a number of fans of the Mother series, led by Clyde Tomato Mandolin. The effort was sizable, with a large group coming together to not just hack the game to make the translation work, but translate the roughly 1,000 pages worth of script. The translation came about after fans tried their best to show an interest in the game internationally, but to no response from Nintendo. A few months after release, Nintendo announced that the company had no interest in translating the game. It would be only a few days after this statement that the fan translation was announced on the Earthbound community site starmen.net. It took the group 2 years to have the translation completed, with the patch downloaded 100,000 times in its first week. Co-founder of Starmen and general PR representative of the project, Reed Young, has stated that higher-ups at Nintendo of America were aware of the work being made. In an interview with Ars Technica, he stated, "Nintendo definitely knew about the project. We're not real comfortable discussing the details, but word of the project reached the highest levels of the company, at least at NOA. For whatever reason, they never interfered. Even now, we don't know if that makes us happy or sad, because we made it very clear that we would end the project immediately if they made any kind of announcement about their plans for the game's future." The translation is of significantly high quality, being released alongside a 200-page full-color player's guide created by the team of translators, comparable to the likes of commercially released guidebooks. Only a few alterations were made to the game, such as changing the name of Yokuba to Facade, altering some graphics to be more fitting with the Western release of Earthbound, and changing the dialect of some mice from Japanese to Cockney English. The group even made a public offer to Nintendo to use their translation, granting the company permission for full use without charge, though it seems to have been to no avail. The game saw a re-release on the Wii U Virtual Console in Japan in 2015, which sparked many in the community to push for Nintendo to also publish the game in the West. Despite some staff at Nintendo having made it clear that they are aware of the interest surrounding the title internationally, there has yet to be any official statement on the game's lack of release, or that it may be released in the future. Whether it will ever happen continues to remain a hotly debated topic, with the community divided, some claiming that its localization will inevitably happen, and others saying that it never will.
Come on, Reggie, give us Mother 3! How about this instead?
Did you know? There wasn't just one F-Zero game on the Super Nintendo, there were 3. As you all know, the first game was a launch title on the Super Famicom, but the other 2 didn't see release until the mid to late 90s. If you've watched this channel before, you'll no doubt remember the Satellaview, a Japanese exclusive add-on that connected the Super Famicom to a satellite radio service. Between 1996 and 1997, 2 F-Zero games were broadcast via Satellaview, containing all new racing tracks, live commentary, and CD quality music. Both games, BS F-Zero Grand Prix 1 and 2, were distributed as weekly broadcasts, with each show pushing exclusive new tracks. Thankfully, the ROM data for all 4 weeks of Grand Prix 1 have been preserved. Grand Prix 2, on the other hand, is a different story. As of the writing of this video, the 2 main broadcasts of Grand Prix 2 have yet to be found. There's no evidence that any collector or archivist has them, and after this many years, any surviving carts could have been overwritten or even have succumbed to bit rot. And it's not that nobody's searching for them. The F-Zero community has gone so far as to put out an active prize bounty of $5,000 total for the 2 broadcasts. Now, let's make ourselves clear, we don't have these broadcasts. Disappointing, we know, but we do have something. See, while the ROMs are still missing, footage of the broadcasts have made its way onto the internet. All Grand Prix broadcasts were recorded during their original airings and uploaded online by a Japanese YouTuber. Using this grainy VHS footage, members of the F-Zero community have done the impossible. They restored the game frame by frame, creating a near one-to-one ROM hack. With pinpoint accuracy, they rebuilt a game without ever touching it. Today we're going to tell you exactly how they did it, why it was made, and how you can play this lost piece of F-Zero media for yourself right now. Sit down for this one though, it's a real doozy. Our story starts January 1993. Nintendo just became the largest shareholder in Saint Giga, a Japanese satellite company founded 3 years prior that made a name for itself as the world's first digital broadcast station. Saint Giga initially aired free radio transmissions via an online network service, but they later changed direction and start charging a subscription fee. This caused a significant drop in ratings, and Saint Giga nearly fell into bankruptcy. So Nintendo couldn't have moved in at a better time. Nintendo's investment in Saint Giga happened in the early 90s, when the internet was finally somewhat accessible to the average household. Network gaming was a hot topic in the industry, as folks no longer needed expensive link-ups and mods to play a multiplayer match of, say, Doom. For the first time, gamers could virtually duke it out miles apart and from the comfort of their own homes, and companies wanted to invest. In late 1993, Sega began testing its Sega Channel add-on for the Genesis. The following year, a company in Silicon Valley released the online X-Band modem for the Genesis and SNES. And as the largest shareholder in Saint Giga, Nintendo was deeply invested in providing a network service for its home consoles. With the 2 companies now hand in hand, work began on a Super Famicom add-on that could connect the system to satellite radio. The Satellaview was born. Nintendo officially announced the Satellaview in December 1994 and launched it the next year for 14,000 yen. It plugged into the underside of the Super Famicom, adding more ROM and RAM and connecting it to the internet. But you'd need 2 cartridges to actually play games. A small 1 MB memory pack that users could repeatedly overwrite that slotted into a BSX cartridge, essentially an interactive hub that sits in the Super Famicom cartridge slot. The Satellaview service aired regular radio programming, as well as software broadcasts, which were games that could be saved onto the memory packs for later use. Some software combined both mediums into SoundLink events. SoundLinks were games synchronized with live radio broadcasts, where Japanese personalities would commentate over gameplay, adding stories and jokes to otherwise plotless games. These games were meant to be played alongside the scheduled radio broadcast, so even if you kept them downloaded, they'd lack the replay value since you'd be playing them without the radio broadcast audio. One example of these SoundLink events was a remake of Super Mario USA, which originally aired alongside Japanese comedians performing an audio drama over the game, giving out hints and leading the player to the end of each level. And F-Zero did something similar. Between December 29, 1996 and January 24, 1997, BS F-Zero Grand Prix aired on the Satellaview. The game was distributed as 4 broadcasts with 1 airing per week. Japanese talking heads would give live commentary while CD quality remixes of F-Zero soundtrack played behind them. Very little is known about the production of this game. Both Grand Prix titles are modified from the original F-Zero source code. Nintendo's internal software department, who designed the actual Satellaview hardware, R&D2, is credited for most of Grand Prix's design. Many of its staff were unassociated with the original F-Zero, though some staff would go on to make other popular titles like Super Mario Bros. Deluxe and Kirby Tilt and Tumble. Of its 3 radio presenters, the only recurring host is Tsuyoshi Bakikoba, a longtime voiceover artist with credits on things like Kamen Rider and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Each week of Grand Prix followed the same format: 5 timed races with 4 new racers, with the 5th race being a brand new course. In order, the weeks or leagues were Knight, Queen, King, and Ace, and some of the new racers included the Blue Thunder and the Fire Scorpion. The new race tracks were sequels to Big Blue and Silence from the first game, as well as an exclusive 2-parter, a windy desert called Sandstorm. In March 1997, Nintendo planned to release a localized version of GP1 for European and North American markets. It seems Nintendo was going to use them as a stopgap of sorts, as the Nintendo 64 game F-Zero X was only about 20% complete and wouldn't see a release until late 1998. That said, it's unknown if work on a localization ever started, with reports from Nintendo Power implying it could have been nothing more than a consideration. The sequel aired between June 1st, 1997 and August 27th and came in 3 installments rather than 4. A standalone BS F-Zero 2 practice aired in June, which prepared players for half of the 10 courses. In August, 2 weeks of Soundlink broadcasts aired, including the other 5 tracks, all brand new. There were 2 tracks for Metal Fort, a purple pink Cyber City, and 3 tracks for Forest, a level that's kind of self-explanatory. F-Zero Grand Prix 2 aired close to the end of the Satellaview's life. Just 1 year later, in August 1998, Nintendo announced they were no longer supplying games to St. Giga, as St. Giga failed to apply for a satellite broadcasting license and refused to let Nintendo reduce the company's capital to address its losses. Nintendo submitted its last piece of original software in March 1998, and the final Soundlink broadcast aired 1 month later to an empty audience. The Satellaview service bid farewell in June of 2000, and the St. Giga name disappeared 3 years later in a merger. It was a quiet end to one of the strangest, forgotten pieces of Nintendo lore. And that brings us to today, where members of the F-Zero community are hard at work searching for copies of Grand Prix 2. In 2018, when videos of GP2 spread around the internet, a veteran ROM hacker called Guy Perfect quickly took notice. Guy is, to put it lightly, an F-Zero superfan with years of experience dissecting the games. The franchise's lost content always haunted him, and he felt compelled to help preserve the series' defunct content by any means necessary. In 2006, he released a level editor for F-Zero X. In 2020, he finished a GP Legend mod with all the Japanese e-reader content added in. Rebuilding Grand Prix 2 was the perfect project for him. Guy's process for preserving GP2 came from an unlikely source. In 2021, an engineer named Flibbity Dibbity began work on what he called a living leaderboard. Flibbity was a big fan of the Super Mario Bros. Speedrunning community and wanted to see what happened if all the best speedruns were played simultaneously. Imagine dozens of plumbers on the same stage at the same time. Mario 35 before Mario 35. For a time, Flibbity's project was being made with machine learning. Speedrun.com recordings were used to train an AI model in the hopes that it'd be able to determine where Mario was at any given time. It ultimately didn't pan out, and they started using humans instead. The tool Flibbity made for that, which he called Graphite, was instrumental in getting the project off the ground. Graphite was a tassing tool with an emulator on one side and a video player on the other, which allowed users to seek frames back and forth and pin down the exact button inputs, causing the emulator to produce the same frame sequence as the recording. This would create an identical frame-by-frame recreation of any given run. Runs could be recreated pixel perfect without the original player ever touching the controller. Graphite gave Guy an idea. If something like this could be done with Mario, maybe it could be done with F-Zero. In 2018, a Japanese YouTuber named Cocoon Kun uploaded footage of all 6 GP Soundlink broadcasts, recorded during their original airing nearly 25 years prior. A lot of the footage you've seen in this video comes from these uploads. Since their release, Guy had been brainstorming a way to identify and reintegrate what was in these recordings. According to Guy, Flibbity's insights was the key to this whole thing. The machine engine settings for Grand Prix 2 are known because they all appeared in Grand Prix 1, as well as the practice game. If I could reproduce the input sequence the player used, I'd know the player's exact location and viewing angle on every frame. And then, knowing that, I'd be able to determine where in the course each pixel came from. The footage you're watching now is one of Guy's earliest prototypes, created using a similar tool he made called Wax. That's Cocoon Kun's footage on the left, resized to the aspect ratio of an SNES game. On the right is a frame-accurate reproduction of their 25-year-old button inputs. Below that, a live updating course map using colors from Cocoon Kun's video and the position data from Guy's reproduction. After 3 laps, here's the recreated map of Metal Fort 2. Although much of the process was automatic, Guy still had to put in many hours of manual labor to get things pixel perfect. One of the most challenging parts of the process was recreating the original art. As you can see from this rebuilt footage of Forest, the sky graphics and the horizon are unfinished and represented by white splotches. Most of GP2's graphics are lifted from previous games, but these backgrounds are 100% original. Recreating artwork from a grainy VHS tape, especially art that's constantly moving around, is not easy. Guy spent months searching for artists to recreate the tracks, but no one was up to the task. That was until September 2023 when a Discord user named Power Panda sent his team a cold call. Earlier that month, data miners discovered a series of unused tracks within the files of fzero 99, including one codenamed Forest. Speculation ran rampant, as fans thought Nintendo was reviving the long-lost Forest tracks from GP2. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. It was a reskin of Mute City 1 with different graphics. Power Panda reached out to Porther, a prominent member of the fzero community, in response to the data mining, looking to assist with his mod in any way possible. Porther was the user behind the $5,000 bounty for GP2 and was also assisting Guy with the upcoming mod. Porther put the two in touch. Guy told us, Panda didn't want to be hyped up and then let down again, so he figured he'd reach out and see if he could help make it happen. The three of us formed the entire creative team behind the mod. Power Panda saved the day with the Sky graphics, Porther assisted with course and graphics recovery, and I mainly focused on programming and course recovery. By October, Power Panda managed to restore the graphics in Metal Fort. Forest was finished in January 2024, the month we completed the script. After countless hours of work, Guy and his team finished their goal. The fzero game that went missing 25 years ago is now playable in the form of a mod. Even better, you can play it now. We have spent the past couple of months working alongside Guy's team in preparation for this release, and we can't thank them enough for their efforts. All credit goes to Guy and company for this release. We are simply spreading the word. The download link for this mod can be found in the description. We hope you all can enjoy this reanimated piece of Nintendo history. But the story isn't over yet. Although we have a nearly one-to-one recreation of F-Zero Grand Prix 2, there's still the issue of the real ROM. We have yet to locate either broadcast, and though we have no evidence that any copies still exist, there's no need to end the search after this release. Again, surviving BSX cartridges are hard to come across and are often rewritten with other games. And it's not just GP2 that's lost. Dozens of Satellaview broadcasts, hundreds upon hundreds of hours, have been lost to time and, at best, only exist as grainy VHS recordings from nearly 3 decades ago. There's still time though. Preservation groups have begun digitizing these old forgotten cartridges, with new broadcasts being discovered yearly. Who knows, maybe one day a Grand Prix cartridge will fall into the right hands and make its way online. For now, all we can do is wait. And remember, there's still that $5,000 on the table.
Did you know? Wario first appeared in the 1992 Game Boy title Super Mario Land 2: 6 Golden Coins. The game was developed by Nintendo's R&D 1 team, who made Metroid and Kid Icarus. R&D 1 avoided working on franchises they didn't have a hand in creating, and found it much easier to invest in characters they had made themselves. This led to them creating Wario to act as Super Mario Land 2's antagonist. Wario was an exaggerated opposite of Mario, and the team believed he helped symbolize their situation. The character proved to be very popular and even took over the Mario Land series of games, which became Wario Land. In Wario Land 2, Wario can undergo special transformations when hit by enemy attacks. One such enemy is a penguin that throws balls. Getting hit by these balls will cause Wario to turn red and stagger around uncontrollably until doused with water, which seemed to make little sense. However, in the original Japanese version of the game, the penguins threw mugs of beer rather than balls. Wario was intoxicated by the beer when hit, but this was censored in the West. The Wario Land series went on hiatus for around 7 years, but saw a revival on the Wii with the release of Wario Land Shake It. The game's producers Takahiro Harada and Etsunobu Ibisa wanted to make the ultimate 2D game with Shake It. Everything in the title was hand-drawn, with no repeated backgrounds. The amount of animation necessary for this was gargantuan. A single action for a character required about 30 frames, leading to 2,000 individual frames for Wario's movements alone, and a further 6,000 for the game's enemies. According to program director Koichi Yagi, the scenery by itself would have filled up the Nintendo GameCube. The Wario games have an odd history of being released either very early or very late in a system's lifecycle. Wario's Woods is both the last officially licensed game for the NES in North America and the only NES game to receive an ESRB rating due to the ratings board being established in 1994. Wario Land 2 is the last first-party Nintendo game to be released for the Game Boy. Conversely, the WarioWare games Touched, Snapped, and Smooth Moves were launch titles for the Nintendo DS, DSi, and Wii respectively. The inspiration for WarioWare came when series director Goro Abe and his team were working on a Nintendo 64 disk drive game called Mario Artist Polygon Studio, an art program where the player could create and animate their own polygonal 3D models. The program included a mode where the player would have to complete several quick minigames in rapid succession. This mode inspired several team members of R&D 1 who wanted to base an entire game around the concept. They began work on the idea without telling their supervisor, arbitrarily choosing Wario as its star because Wario was always doing stupid things and was really idiotic. When the team members eventually came clean, the project was approved, and WarioWare Inc. Mega Micro Games was released for the Game Boy Advance. In explaining the game's concept, Abe stated, "With the first WarioWare game, it wasn't so much the specific character of the game that marked it out, but rather that Nintendo was quite a different company back then. Both inside and outside of the company, there was a distinct image that we only produced Nintendo-style games. WarioWare was born out of a desire to depart from the norm, with that particular kind of fun that you only get when you make something different." When Nintendo decided to release WarioWare Touched as a launch title for the DS, the team was already deep in development on WarioWare Twisted for the Game Boy Advance. In order to get Touched off the ground, a new team was assembled. However, almost every member of the team was a newcomer to the series, and they struggled to capture the humor of a WarioWare game. This prompted series producer and Metroid co-creator Yoshio Sakamoto to step in. When work on Twisted was complete, the regular WarioWare team also helped to ensure Touched humor was in line with the rest of the series, and that the game was finished in time for the DS's launch. The game's release, however, generated some controversy. One of the unlockable in-game extras was a record that played Ashley's song, and the player could spin this record on the touchscreen to control the song's speed. According to some, if the record was spun fast enough, it would produce a voice saying, "I have granted kids to hell." Nintendo refuted these claims, explaining the supposed lyrics were derived from the verse "Eye of Newt, I cast a hex on you, Grandma's wig, this will make you big, kitten spit, soon your pants won't fit." By speeding the song up, only certain syllables were played, resulting in the misheard lyrics, "Eye of Grand, this kitsu pan." In the Japanese version of Ashley's song, she casts the spell. When read backwards, the spell says, "Umedo in Wario is Junanuba 1," or roughly, "Made in Wario is number 1," Made in Wario being the Japanese name for the WarioWare series. WarioWare Snapped, another game in the series, released as a downloadable game. Difficulties with reliably incorporating the camera into the gameplay almost forced Nintendo to release the game on a cartridge with unusual peripherals. According to Intelligent Systems employee Taku Sugioka, if there were a ravine and characters couldn't cross, you could use a silhouette of your finger as a bridge to allow them to cross. But when we started testing it out, we learned the camera was having difficulty detecting the hand, so we laid a black mat underneath so shadows wouldn't form and distort the detection. But then, someone with a dark suntan wouldn't be detected, so we made a finger sleeve for the player's index finger. Anyone, regardless of variations in skin tone, would be able to play. We were seriously considering selling the game together with the finger sleeve and black mat. The main draw in WarioWare Smooth Moves was its different forms, or ways for the player to hold the Wii Remote during gameplay. While working on the in-game descriptions for the forms, Abe and Sakamoto discussed how to make them sound more over the top. At that moment, a Canadian member of the team walked by their window, and Sakamoto spontaneously asked him to record some lines of Japanese dialogue. The voice of a non-native speaker ended up being exactly the feel they were looking for, and his voiceover was used in the final release. Unlike the Wii U didn't feature a WarioWare launch title. Instead, a team of developers, including Abe, was tasked with creating a number of small games to come pre-installed on the Wii U to show off the gamepad's unique functionality. The team came up with so many ideas that they decided to produce a standalone title instead. However, the ideas were so different from each other that they had difficulty tying them together thematically. About a year into development, the team decided to use WarioWare characters to provide a unifying narrative for the collection, and the project became Game & Wario. The creative freedoms that developers had with Wario allowed them to give him more personality. One example can be found in Wario World for the GameCube. The game is known for its grating pause screen music, where Wario endlessly sings a mocking tune. However, if the player withstands Wario's song for a full 50 minutes, he will actually apologize to them.
Skip Limited are a company best known for their work on the Chibi Robo series, which spans numerous Nintendo consoles. They're also known for their art-style games for DSiWare and WiiWare. While the majority of these games released internationally, Skip developed a game that never quite made it to the West, and has since become infamous online. Today, we'll be talking about Captain Rainbow. Captain Rainbow released in 2008 for the Nintendo Wii. The game's story follows Nick, a TV star in his homeland of Memurica. Nick is famous for his alter ego, Captain Rainbow, a superhero whose weapon of choice is a magical yo-yo. However, new and different superheroes become the latest trend, and Nick's ratings start to plummet. In an attempt to regain his popularity, he travels to Mimin Island. Rafting across the ocean, Nick comes across a small animal struggling in the water. Heroically, he transforms into Captain Rainbow and dives in to save them. Unfortunately, however, water is Captain Rainbow's weakness, mostly because he can't swim, and Nick is separated from his rainbow belt, the source of his power. Nick awakens on the shores of Mimin Island with the animal he tried to save alongside him. The mysterious creature then conjures a magical bangle around Nick's wrist. After seeing more creatures make off with his belt, Nick follows them and discovers a small village. There, he meets Hikari, a girl who cares for the shrine on the island. She also has the ability to see into the future through visions. She tells him that visitors come to the island to have their dreams come true. However, it has never actually happened. She goes on to explain that the person wearing the bangle is chosen by the stars, and only they can open the mysterious ancient stone door in the shrine and change the fate of the islanders. The player takes control of Nick as he attempts to befriend the people of Mimin Island by fulfilling tasks to help them achieve their dreams. He is awarded stars, or sparklies, by completing a variety of tasks and minigames set out by the inhabitants, or through exploration of the island. In order to fulfill a wish, the player must first collect 20 sparklies. This process must be repeated for each character. All of the residents of Mimin Island are early Nintendo characters who, for the most part, at the time, were relatively obscure or lesser used within Nintendo's releases. Hikari, who helps Nick when he first arrives on the island. She is one of the protagonists of the Japanese-exclusive Famicom Disk System title Shin Onigashima. Takamaru, the protagonist from the mysterious Murasame Castle, who wishes to be able to keep his composure around women. Birdo, one of the few characters who reached a certain level of popularity within Nintendo releases. They have come to the island to become attractive and popular with men. The soldiers from the Japanese-exclusive game Famicom Wars, who seem to have given up their war-driven lives and instead express a wish to become professional volleyball players. Little Mac, the protagonist of Punch-Out!, who has let himself go physically. His desire is to train and become a world champion boxer once again. Osan, the playable character featured in the NES title Golf, often mistaken for Mario. He wishes to become a legendary golfer. Mappo and Tao, originating from the Japanese-exclusive GameCube title Gift Pia, Mappo wishes to become a detective, and Tao wants nothing more than to eat as many bones as he can before he dies. Lip, one of the playable characters from Panel de Pon, released as Tetris Attack internationally, her desire is to become a great magician. Tracy, who sells Link medicine in The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, bearing little resemblance to her earlier appearance in Zelda, her wish is to enslave all men in the world. The Devil from Devil World, also a Japan and Europe exclusive title, his wish is to be the best villain in all of the underworld. And lastly, Gitcho Man from the Chibi Robo series, who wishes to understand the difference between right and wrong. Character locations and events change through a day-night cycle, requiring the player to be in specific locations at certain times. To assist with his journey, Nick is able to transform into Captain Rainbow after he recovers his rainbow belt. As Captain Rainbow, Nick can break rocks to clear paths as well as navigate the island faster with increased movement speed. While in his Captain Rainbow state, a power bar is displayed which depletes over time. To keep the bar charged, the player must find food to consume. Failing to do so will result in a game over. Captain Rainbow's skills can be upgraded throughout the game by way of belt modifications. The history of the island can be revealed by discovering rocks, known as schists. These provide more story and history surrounding the mysterious location. A number of collectibles are also scattered around, such as animals which Nick is able to log in an animal encyclopedia. By granting the wishes of 3 people, the player is rewarded with access to their own portable caravan, which can be moved by Captain Rainbow. In the caravan, it's possible to save, as well as sleep to progress time, as opposed to having to do so in Ikari's house. While Captain Rainbow received a lot of attention online, very little action was taken to bring the game across the pond for an international audience. Sales of the game were few, with only 6,361 copies being sold in the first week of release, though reviews seemed mostly positive, with Famitsu scoring the game 31 out of 40, praising the gameplay, pacing, and musical score, though being put off by the often vulgar humor. Many of the themes presented in Captain Rainbow can be considered lewd. Such is the case with Birdo's story. Birdo has been imprisoned in a cage by Mappo after he found her in the women's bathroom, mistaking her for a man. This is a reference to Birdo's historically ambiguous gender. Birdo asks Nick to prove her innocence, leading him to search for an item that he can show to Mappo as proof. This leads Nick to find an item which is only shown as a question mark, found vigorously vibrating underneath Birdo's pillow, suggesting that the item is in fact a female sex toy. A number of references are spread throughout the game, including the use of warp pipes a la Mario Brothers, as well as portraits of both Mario and Link from The Legend of Zelda hanging over Tracy's throne. Low sales, controversial themes, and regional exclusive obscure characters likely gave Nintendo the impression that the title wouldn't be a strong contender overseas, or could land them in hot water with consumers. Despite this, a huge effort was taken by the translation group Kirameki, with the assistance of several other independent translators. Kirameki first began showing work on their translation in 2012, but after years of work, no patch had been released. While an almost fully translated script had been created, the team were unable to insert their translation into the game. It wasn't until 2016 when romhacking.net user Mark Arse reinvigorated interest in the project, ultimately releasing an incomplete patch in late 2017 using the original script posted by Kirameki. This patch is theoretically 95% complete and makes the game playable in English.
Did you know? Wario games have been subject to a lot of regional changes, notably with the WarioWare line of games. WarioWare Smooth Moves has a different title for each region it was released in, with the Japanese version even having its own unique title theme. Smooth Moves also has the player make poses with the Wii Remote called forms that prepare the player for certain styles of microgames. Interestingly, nearly all 19 of these forms were altered to better suit international audiences. Many made references to Japanese culture, so these forms were localized with some clever workarounds. An example being the Japanese Tengu form being changed to an elephant form internationally, as both are known for their long noses. One form which depicted an important figure in Japanese history, Prince Shotoku, was changed to a janitor. The janitor's description mirrored Shotoku's, balancing the earth and the heavens with his baton, but instead balancing order and filth with his mop. Several microgames were also changed. A microgame based on Star Fox features Rob the Robot with the Famicom beam gun in the Japanese game, and with the NES Zapper in the West, coupled with Rob's appropriate color scheme for the regions. A microgame from WarioWare Twisted has roots in the Chinese story Journey to the West. The microgame was known as Slapjack internationally, and referred to the story of Jack and the Beanstalk instead. A driver's ed game has players drive on the right side of the road in Japan, and on the left side in North America. Wario Land Shake It also had a regional difference. It was called Wario Land The Shake Dimension in PAL regions, and simply Wario Land Shake in Japan and Wario Land Shaking in South Korea. The idea for Wario Land Shake It came about from Nintendo producer Takahiro Harada, who had a desire to revive the Wario Land series. Harada had recently played a Goemon platformer for the Nintendo DS, and enjoyed it so much he looked up the game's producer Etsunobu Ibitsu, who recently left Konami to found his own studio, Good Feel. Ibitsu wanted the studio to collaborate with Nintendo, and Harada claims the timing could not have been better. When the two decided on making a Wario game, Ibitsu initially thought of making a Western-style shooter, being a genre he was playing a lot of at the time. Harada instead suggested they make a platformer, with that style being what the two knew best. The game's director, Madoka Yamauchi, proposed the game's hand-drawn style, a style the team was initially worried about doing. After seeing it in action with the rough line drawings, however, they agreed that the style had a great feel that couldn't be replicated with 3D polygons. Their goal was to make the ultimate 2D game, as it was something that hadn't been achieved before. The animation was provided by Production IG, known for their work on anime such as Ghost in the Shell and Fooly Cooly. They previously worked with Nintendo on the FMV cutscenes for Fire Emblem Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, and later provided animation for Kid Icarus Uprising's Thanatos Rising shorts. Since everything was hand-drawn and no backgrounds were repeated, even a small change in level design meant a lot of work had to be redone. For Shake It, design director Tadanori Sukawaki wanted to show off more of a macho side to Wario, as opposed to his usual crass and rude qualities. This came about after he played the earlier Wario Land games, and got the impression he was actually quite manly. Sukawaki said, "He's so uncool that he ends up being extremely cool. Depending on the game, he can be coarse, farting and doing stuff like that, but I didn't want to show that side of him. As much as possible, I wanted to show a macho Wario, one who is masculine and tough." He asked the animators to truly emphasize the direction they were going for with this side of Wario. Some women who worked on the game initially complained about Wario, more specifically his nose, but by the end of development found him pretty cool. Though the game didn't sell very well, Goodfeel would later go on to develop more Nintendo games, such as Kirby's Epic Yarn and Yoshi's Woolly World. Certain sound effects from Shake It can be heard in these games as well. Wario's victory theme from Smash Bros. Brawl was later remixed for Shake It's first level, Stone Carving City. Since Brawl and Shake It were released within 4 months of each other, it may have been an international Easter egg for Wario's upcoming appearance post-Smash. Wario has crossed over with several other series in rather strange ways. The Game Boy title, Wario Blast, featuring Bomberman, is a reskinned Western-exclusive version of the Japan-only Bomberman GB. With the exception of Wario's presence, the game remains relatively unchanged from its Bomberman roots. The original game was released in Japan in August 1994, and made its way to North America in November that year, and in PAL regions in 1995. When Bomberman GB2 released in the West in 1998, 3 years removed from its original Japan release, it simply went under the name Bomberman GB as to not confuse gamers. Bomberman GB3 released in Japan in 1996, but didn't make its way to the West in any form. Though Wario Blast has never been referenced in later games, Wario has frequently been associated with bombs in later appearances, similar to how Mario Bros. 2 introduced defining traits of playable characters despite being a reskin of Doki Doki Panic. Bob-ombs, which also debuted in Mario 2, are commonly paired up with Wario in the Mario Party and tennis games, and the Mario 64 DS game Bob-omb Squad is tied to Wario. In Mario Kart Double Dash, Wario's special item is the Bob-omb, and the logo for the WarioWare series features the Wario Bomb. Keeping in line with Wario clashing with other series, the recurring Wario Land character, Mad Science Dean, first appeared in the Japanese exclusive Game Boy game Keru no Tame ni Kane wa Naru, referred to as For Whom the Frog Bell Tolls in English, before making his Western debut in Wario Land 3. For Whom the Frog Bell Tolls was developed by Nintendo's R&D 1 team, the same group who created the Wario franchise. Science Dean later showed up in Dr. Mario 64 and Wario Land 4. The former game's roster is made up almost entirely of Wario characters, and the latter's guidebook officially states the connection between the Wario series and For Whom the Frog Bell Tolls. A remixed version of the Frog Bell Tolls main theme also appears as an unlockable record in WarioWare DIY. Wario's also said to have something he cares about even more than money: a pet. In Wario Land 2, he has a pet chicken simply named Hen.
With the birth of the Nintendo 64, Nintendo realized one problem with their new foray in the console space: third-party support. Many other consoles, particularly those working with disc-based technology, had a plethora of third-party developers helping build the catalogue of games available on their systems. Nintendo, on the other hand, working with a more limited cartridge format, struggled to gain widespread support. They developed a new add-on for the Nintendo 64 called the 64DD, which would help improve the system's capabilities. Though this venture proved to be limited in execution, ultimately being released exclusively in Japan, Nintendo didn't stop there, also looking to help finance more independent studios specifically to release games on Nintendo's platform. Though more than 60 games were announced for the add-on, of the 9 games that did see a release on the 64DD by the end of its production, only one ultimately saw a port for Nintendo's next console, the GameCube. But it would not see publication in the United States. That game was Doshin the Giant. Doshin the Giant was developed by Param in partnership with Nintendo, who published the title in 1999 for the Nintendo 64 DD, and 2002 for the GameCube. The initial DD release was exclusive to Japan, of course, as the system never left the country, while the GameCube port was published in both Japan and Europe. The game is presented through spoken narration by a native called Sodoru, from the island Barudo. Sodoru covers his face with a mask and tells a legend of a giant that rose from a sea as the sun rose in the morning, and would return to the surf at sunset. While telling this legend, Doshin, the friendly love giant, makes his appearance. The player takes on the role of Doshin, while Sodoru tells the player about the desires of the island's inhabitants, starting with a simple request such as having more trees or having their hills reformed. In return, the people of the island will shower Doshin with love, in the form of hearts, which in turn help increase his size. However, there is a more sinister side to Doshin. He is capable of transforming into a starkly contrasting version of himself, Jashin, the angry hate giant. With each passing day, the giant will return to the sea. The next day, Doshin returns, though this is not the same giant. Each day, a new generation of giant appears at its original size. This isn't to say that each day is starting anew, as each giant will be recorded, and the islanders' relationship with the giants will be inherited by their next incarnation. Sodoru suggests that the giant may be able to help unite the 4 tribes living across the land. No small feat, and something which will take up the majority of Doshin's time. Ultimately, the game's main goal is to have villagers create monuments towards Doshin, some out of love and some out of hate. Whilst this is the main goal of the game, the player is able to simply spend their time enjoying the island, tending to the villagers for as long as they like. Each in-game day lasts for about 30 minutes, and during that time the player can fulfill requests to bolster their reputation amongst the villagers of the island by improving their quality of life. These range from needing more trees, raising or lowering the ground, removing obstructions, or simply wishing for the gift of a flower from the giant. Doshin only has a few skills at his disposal, all based around his monumental size. He is able to manipulate the landscape by raising or lowering the ground, and his size also allows him to pick up objects and transport them, including trees, villages, and even buildings. He is capable of jumping in order to avert certain natural disasters, though because of his size, this will affect the landscape beneath him. When Doshin turns into his evil Jashin form, the ability to pick up objects is replaced with the ability to smash the ground, and to fire a shockwave which can alter the landscape. The button can even be held in to continuously fire. Doshin's size grows after the counter around the perimeter of the screen has been filled with either hearts or skulls, indicating love or hate respectively. If Doshin does something that pleases the villagers, hearts will start to form clockwise around the screen, but if he does something to make them hate him, skulls will appear anti-clockwise. The hearts and skulls are capable of overriding each other, as a full circle of only one type is required to make the giant grow. At times with the giant's growth, issues can also arise. Whilst being larger will allow Doshin to move larger objects or traverse the island quicker, he can also more easily crush villagers and buildings under his feet. The villagers rely on a green energy supplied by trees, often required for them to construct new buildings. After some time, however, trees, like all living organisms, will wither away and die. By placing trees near a water source, their life can be prolonged. Placing the wilted old trees together will help them regain their vitality. Giant boxes also appear in a variety of places across Barudo Island, dropping from the sky or found under houses revealed after picking them up. Inside, the player can find a bunch of trees, love or hate, or even new villagers from a random tribe. The boxes can sometimes give clues as to what they contain. There are 4 tribes of villagers: red, green, yellow, and blue, with each starting in a different area of the island, all of which request help in building their village. Each colored tribe builds a different monument for the giant. By bringing villagers of different tribes together in uninhabited locations, they are able to start a new village tribe under a shared banner of their combined colors, which will in turn eventually build a new monument, with 15 of the monuments coming from various color combinations of tribes. In order to start the construction of a monument, villagers will ask for a flower from the giant. Flowers grow in an area where there are 7 trees close to each other. Once together, they will wither and die, and 8 new trees will begin to grow in their place, as well as a small red flower. Only one flower can be used on the island at a time. If there are 2 or more, only one will survive. Natural disasters can occur around the island, causing destruction. This includes the appearance of tornadoes, volcanic eruptions, or the appearance of spirits known as naughties, who will appear and steal villages or trees. Doshin is able to counter these disasters, however, reducing their damage. After each day, the player is shown a list of the actions they performed, as well as a number of comments from the villagers, varying in their value. positive, negative, or simply just indifferent. The game returns the player to a title screen in which they can review constructed monuments in the monument list, check their photos that have been taken in-game in their photo album, as well as check the stats of the previous days spent on the island in the Book of the Giants. Every new day, Doshin will start at the ornamental hairpin, an object which he is also able to move, changing where the player initially spawns on the island. The core concepts of the game remain the same in both 64DD and GameCube releases of the title. There is actually a sequel to Doshin the Giant, though it could be seen as more of an expansion. Roughly translated as Doshin the Giant Tinkling Toddler Liberation Front Assemble, the sequel is a completely different game that requires the use of the original Doshin the Giant. The game takes place at the Doshin Exhibition 96, where Doshin the Giant has been captured, chained up, and stands center stage. The player takes control of a child who is whisked out of their bed and into the world of dreams, where they find the imprisoned Doshin. The expansion's perspective is 2.5D, with the main character appearing as a flat silhouette of a child, maneuvering around a 3D environment via a side-scrolling motion. The child has a heart meter that is continually filling up, resulting in a game over should it reach capacity. In order to avoid this, the child can tinkle hearts out. Doing so on signs and people will interact with them, and signs representing the variety of monuments found in the initial Doshin release. If tinkled on, the player will need to prove that they have a monument built in their base game by switching discs. If successful, a pavilion will be built in the sign's place in the dream world, as well as a queen companion appearing. This queen companion will set obscure tasks to complete in the original Doshin the Giant. If accomplished, the player will be rewarded with a movie. There are 17 movies in total to collect, each with the same title, More Than Giant. These movies are black and white scenes based around the original game. The player can also tinkle on other kids and challenge them to a tinkle contest, with the opponent joining the player's team if beaten, improving the player's tinkle ability. The aim of the game is to tinkle on Doshin, making him bigger, eventually big enough to escape. The game's creator, Kazutoshi Ida, said that at the start of his career in developing video games, he had set himself a personal rule to create 3 games: Aquanaut's Holiday, Tale of the Sun, and last but not least, Doshin the Giant. His initial entrance into game development was to create what he called games without a goal, something which would allow the player to not just be entertained, but to take their time observing and learning more about themselves, whilst they learned more about his games. In this sense, Kazutoshi's approach to game development was to create art over interactive entertainment. His focus is on kansatsu, or observation. It is through observation that people allow themselves to think of new ideas and explore more about the world, as well as themselves. Doshin began development as a Nintendo 64DD exclusive, with the game being released as a launch title for the system, one of only 2. In total, only 9 games were ever released for the system, with many games considered for development on the console ultimately being cancelled or shifted to new platforms. During an interview with IGN, Ida revealed that he believed it possible to convert Doshin to a cartridge-based title easily, only taking out a few features that would only work on the 64DD. He also revealed that the team behind Doshin was made up of only 6 members of staff, and that they were continuing to think up new ideas for Doshin on the 64DD, thus leading to the game's expansion pack. While porting Doshin over to the GameCube, some elements of the game were altered. The mechanic of requiring flowers for building monuments was not in the original release. Several monuments were altered. The ability for Doshin to slide down hills was added, and the GameCube release includes additional islands after completion, as well as multiple endings, whilst the 64DD only had 1. Doshin was to be the mascot of the 64DD and RandNet online subscription service that was provided with it. Various items were available to be purchased, including t-shirts, the soundtrack, an art book for Doshin, and Doshin the official guidebook, which was also given away with the subscription. For the short time RandNet was available, subscribers were given a Doshin Christmas card on the 2nd year, and a Doshin newsletter was included with the regular newsletter sent to every member. This, however, only lasted from December to September 2000. Doshin made his first appearance in the US with the release of Super Smash Bros. Melee, as a trophy shown holding a villager in his hands. Jashin would also appear, though both would be known as the Love Giant and the Hate Giant respectively, rather than their given names. One concept that had been considered by Miyamoto for the title was having the game take place across a truly spherical planet, but after presenting the idea to the team behind Doshin, they had already gone far too deep into development to go back and include such an idea. Ultimately, this concept would be given new life with the creation of Super Mario Galaxy. Within the data of Doshin the Giant is an unused graphic showing the face of a young boy, likely used as an early placeholder. The child's identity is unknown. Allegedly, the strange name of Doshin is actually a slightly modified onomatopoeia of the sound the giant makes when his feet tread on the earth. Param had told IGN in 1999 that the company was in talks with Nintendo of America to bring the original 64DD release to the United States in a cartridge format, as the 64DD was exclusively released in Japan, and thus would need to be converted to work on a standard Nintendo 64 console. Unconfirmed rumors also circulated that Infogrames were interested in possibly publishing the game in the US, but this also never came to fruition. Doshin the Giant's lack of GameCube release in the United States is actually related to the release of an entirely different game, one which wouldn't see release in Europe. Cubivore: Survival of the Fittest received a release in America, another game which was initially created for the 64DD before transitioning to the GameCube. When asked, Shigeru Miyamoto said that both titles were being reviewed by Nintendo to confirm their suitability for international localization. Atlus announced later that they would take on the publishing task for Cubivore in the US, whilst Nintendo published Doshin in Europe, and both developed by two studios who operated as subsidiary groups of Marigold Management, a company that Nintendo had created to recruit independent game companies. The company, a joint venture between Nintendo and Recruit, a human resources company, was formed after Nintendo found the N64 lacking in third-party support. Marigold would provide the companies with financing, as to let the game studio simply focus on the creation of new titles, with the condition being that the games be ready within 5 years. The lack of American release for Doshin, but the presence of Cubivore in the region, suggests that Nintendo wasn't keen on publishing an extensive number of niche titles across the world, due to the risk of failure when it comes to returns on investment. Depending on your interest in gaming, it's either unfortunate for Europe that there was no release of Cubivore, or unfortunate for America that they would never be able to experience life as a giant just trying to spread a little love or hate.
Did you know? The original arcade cabinet of Punch-Out was created partially as a method of utilizing excess televisions. After a major success with Donkey Kong, Nintendo ordered monitors in excess of their sales, leading to an overstock. When asked about the surplus TVs, Nintendo's general hardware manager Genyo Takeda stated, "The televisions weren't being used. Tons of them were in our Uji plant, so we were given this proposition. Create a new arcade game that uses 2 televisions. 2 televisions could use up more stock than 1. Originally, Nintendo proposed the creation of a racing game that used both monitors, but the chip could only handle 1 image being enlarged at a time. Realizing this, Takeda suggested the effect could be used on a single person. This led to the idea of a boxing game and ultimately Punch-Out. When talking about how they would handle the 2 television setup, General Manager of Nintendo Shigeru Miyamoto stated, "We were stuck for a little bit by that, but then we thought that a boxing arena has big lights and banners hanging from the ceiling with things like World Heavyweight Title Match written on them. This would have a lot of meters as well, so we thought maybe having 2 screens would be more fun, and we tried stacking 2 screens vertically. It felt good, so we decided to use that 2-screen setup." Punch-Out was a roaring success, and demand for the game was so high that a sequel was pushed out the following year, titled Super Punch-Out. A spin-off by the same development team named Arm Wrestling also appeared exclusively in the North American market. The same dual monitor setup was used, and like Punch-Out, Arm Wrestling contained very eccentric opponents. Arm Wrestling's third opponent, Mask X for example, was revealed to be Punch-Out's bald bull once defeated. The NES version of Punch-Out wasn't actually the first to appear on home consoles. In 1985, an unlicensed version of Super Punch-Out was ported to the ZX Spectrum and the Commodore 64 called Frank Bruno's Boxing. Rather than starring Little Mac, the player assumed control of popular English boxer Frank Bruno. Of the 8 opponents you could face, only 3 appeared from the arcade version of Super Punch-Out. However, all their names were changed. Dragon Chan was renamed Fling Long Chop, Bear Hugger was given the name Canadian Crusher, and Vodka Trokensky was dubbed Andra Puncheradov. When development on the NES port of Punch-Out began, Takeda realized they'd have to severely downsize the graphics seen in the arcade version to fit into the NES. The NES wouldn't be able to handle the layered characters, so they opted for a shorter playable character, leaving plenty of room to see the opposing boxers. Another side effect of these limitations included the repeated use of graphical character assets. A lot of opponents share similar but recolored body parts, such as Piston Honda and Bald Bull. When reflecting on this, Nintendo's Makoto Wada stated, "The memory limit on the NES was severe, so we had to break the pictures into parts and rotate them, or call up these parts partially. But no matter how you looked at the drawn images, the proportions were kind of strange. But when you actually made the move, the movement started looking right. I thought that this is how you make video games." The arcade version of Punch-Out was notoriously short, so while creating a home version, Takeda wondered if the game's length would suffice. Nintendo focused on making the NES version a bigger overall experience, with gameplay that relied on memorization and learning the game's mechanics. This led to the introduction of specific character tells and instant knockouts. Also new to the port was background music, a password system, and animated cutscenes showing Little Mac training with Doc Lewis. Makoto Wada also drew the sprite for Mario as the referee, which he snuck into the game without permission from Mario's creator, Shigeru Miyamoto. When Wada revealed this information, he also told of a secret way to attack Bald Bull. If the player attacks when a light flashes to the right of the audience, they'll land a body blow. According to Wada, this went undiscovered for 22 years. There are several different variations of Punch-Out on the NES and the Famicom. In Japan, Punch-Out was originally a prize for the Second Family Computer Golf Tournament, a Nintendo-sponsored tournament for the NES game Golf. This version of the game wasn't available to the general public, had a gold cartridge, and lacked the final encounter with Mike Tyson. Shortly after the gold version was released, Nintendo of America founder Minoru Arakawa was attending a boxing match with soon-to-be heavyweight champion Mike Tyson. Enamored by his performance, Arakawa reached out to Tyson in hopes of using his name and likeness in the American release of Punch-Out. Tyson's inclusion led to increased sales, as he coincidentally took the heavyweight championship from Trevor Berbick around the same time. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out was such a hit in America that it was eventually given a full retail release in Japan. Although Tyson gave permission to use his likeness, and obviously knew of the game's existence, he had never played the game until a 2013 special on Fox Sports 26 years after Punch-Out's initial release. Mike Tyson would continue to grace the game's box art until licensing agreements expired in 1990. However, it was Nintendo that decided not to renew the license due to a massive upset in a match against James Buster Douglas, who would be the first to knock out previously undefeated champion Tyson. A final version of Punch-Out was re-released in 1990, replacing the former champion with an original character named Mr. Dream. After the initial success of Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, a direct sequel made its way into production. The game was originally entitled Mike Tyson's Intergalactic Power Punch and featured Tyson going through space for the purpose of fighting against the best boxers in the universe. However, due to being incarcerated for sexual assault in 1991, Tyson's likeness was taken out of the game completely. Instead, Mike Tyson's Intergalactic Power Punch was renamed to Power Punch 2 and saw release in 1992 under a different publisher. This confused consumers as a Power Punch 1 didn't exist. The follow-up to the NES hit Super Punch-Out came out in 1994 in North America and 95 in Europe. However, the game wouldn't see a Japanese release until 1998, well into the life cycle of the Nintendo 64. Like the gold version of the original, Super Punch-Out would not receive a retail release, but instead was an early digital release via the Nintendo Power Flash RAM cartridge. Unrelated to the North American magazine, the Nintendo Power was a Japan-only cart for the Super Famicom and Game Boy that would allow users to digitally download games at a cheaper price. Cartridges could be brought to a store that carried the Nintendo Power Copier, where select games are available for download. These carts would typically hold 2 to 3 games at a time, but games containing special chips, for example the Super FX chip, could not be copied. This service was discontinued in 2007. The Punch-Out universe has seen cameos from other Nintendo franchises such as Mario, Luigi, Donkey Kong, and Donkey Kong Jr. all appearing in the audience of the original Punch-Out. One cameo, however, never came to fruition. Princess Peach was actually a planned opponent for Punch-Out Wii that was dropped because of the possible negative reaction to violence against women. Other popular Nintendo characters were considered to be opponents as well, but were dropped in favor of expanding the Punch-Out world and its characters. Mario didn't return as a referee as developers thought the toon-shaded 3D atmosphere of the game wouldn't be a good fit for the plumber. Several games have also paid homage to Punch-Out! Little Mac appeared in the WarioWare series and the GameCube version of Fight Night Round 2.
Pilot Wings, Nintendo's amateur flight simulator franchise, lay dormant for around 15 years after its 1996 installment on the Nintendo 64. It finally re-emerged at the launch of the Nintendo 3DS in 2011, breaking its extended hiatus with Pilot Wings Resort. However, throughout the 2000s, we almost saw the series return on multiple separate occasions across 2 generations of Nintendo hardware. The first of these came close to happening on the GameCube in around 2003. Nintendo had been in talks with Turrican and Star Wars Rogue Squadron developers Factor 5 to bring an alternative take on the series. It was intended to be done sometime after the development of Star Wars Rogue Squadron 3 Rebel Strike, and was even teased by then CEO of Nintendo Satoru Iwata at E3 2003. Julian Eggebrecht, the president of Factor 5 Inc., was directing the project, envisioning a Pilot Wing set in the real world during the height of the Cold War. It was supposed to have the player train as a pilot in its initial stages before being recruited to carry out top-secret missions for the military using various aircraft. Vastly different in theme and tone from any previous entry in the series, Pilot Wings for GameCube was inspired by some of Eggebrecht's favourite films, namely The Right Stuff from 1983, a movie which revolved around the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Despite both Factor 5 and Nintendo being enthusiastic about the game's potential, it was ultimately prevented from moving forward. Factor 5's main partner and benefactor was LucasArts, who had worked with them closely on the Star Wars Rogue Squadron games. With them, they had produced both Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 and 3 as GameCube exclusives. While Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 was a huge success at the launch of the system, its follow-up didn't perform nearly as well, much to the dismay of LucasArts. Blaming the GameCube's lackluster sales, they began putting pressure on Factor 5 to end their exclusive relationship with Nintendo and start porting the Star Wars titles to the Xbox, a console with a larger install base. Factor 5 eventually succumbed to their demands, starting development on a collection of the Rogue Squadron games for the Xbox and taking their ideas for the Pilot Wings project with them. In the end, the Cold War flight project that was originally supposed to be a Pilot Wings reboot never came together, and neither did their Xbox port of the Rogue Squadron games for that matter, which was shut down at around 50% completion in 2004. Around 3 to 4 years after the GameCube Pilot Wings fizzled out, Factor 5 had since been through a succession of rocky partnerships with Microsoft and Sony. Julian Eggebrecht and his associates had been wanting to try their hand at creating games for the Nintendo Wii. When their collaboration with Sony met a premature end, they immediately jumped into Wii development in August 2007. Nintendo, who had since remained friendly with them, was pleased to have them back on board. Factor 5 began putting together pitches to work on a couple of first-party Nintendo properties as potential Wii exclusives. One of these, being made by a team of developers under Eggebrecht's close supervision, was their revised spin on Pilot Wings. On the Wii, they adopted a very different approach to the series. As opposed to the dark, Cold War affair they had once suggested, they went for something lighter and more marketable to the Wii's audience. Its art style was particularly reminiscent of the Wii Sports airplane demo that was shown at E3 2006. In comparison with their previous attempt on the GameCube, it was much more oriented towards casual players, but that's not to say the project was any smaller on ambition. On the contrary, had it been made, it would have been by far the largest Pilot Wings game to date, with a wealth of content laid out. The game would have operated as one massive open world based loosely around planet Earth. Players would have set off to explore it in various aircraft, flying over and completing missions around iconic real-life landmarks. The pitch's largest innovation, however, was its use of a brand new peripheral Factor 5 had designed. They had entered talks with Nintendo for them to produce it as an officially licensed Nintendo Wii accessory. This was a pair of glasses to be worn by the user that were capable of tracking head movement. Former staff say it was inspired by an experiment devised by computer scientist Johnny Chung Lee. In 2007, he released a video showing a homemade setup of his involving a pair of glasses with infrared LEDs attached. Using the infrared camera in the Wii remote by placing it in front of a television, he used it to track the position and movement of the lights mounted on the glasses. glasses. Utilized in tandem with a computer program displayed on a TV, this produced a 3D effect for the wearer. It could also allow the user to explore more of the environment displayed on the TV by simply turning their head and adjusting their position. Factor 5 developed their own version of the head tracking technology to work directly with the Wii using essentially the same principles, headgear emitting two sources of infrared light that the Wii could track. I spoke with Julian Egbrecht, who shed more light on this aspect of the project. According to Julian, his developers created their own early prototypes for the glasses peripheral to sell the idea to Nintendo, which were made using parts from dismantled Wii sensor bars. They were able to implement their glasses prototype into two of the games they had in the works at the time, their demo for Pilot Wings and their revamped Wii collection of the Star Wars Rogue Squadron titles. In both games, they essentially served the same purpose on a gameplay level. The player could tilt their head to control the in-game camera, creating a solution for the Wii Remote's lack of a C-stick, even when coupled with a nunchuck. Via head tracking, players could naturally manipulate their viewpoint by turning and looking inside the screen with a 3D effect of sorts. Julian told me that it worked like a charm, and that the effect was especially impressive when switching to the first-person cockpit view built into both games. To take advantage of this feature and encourage players to use it, the developers started to place Easter eggs into the cockpits. For example, one artist added a picture of a cat to the interior of one of the vehicles. Former Factor 5 members are tight-lipped about why exactly this happened, but their pitch to do the Pilot Wings Wii game was eventually turned down by Nintendo in mid-2008. One ex-developer offered speculation that it might have been turned down due to Nintendo already working on the Island Flyover game in Wii Sports Resort, which was heavily inspired by Pilot Wings, and that they may have already had their own plans for the series at that point, since Pilot Wings Resort released just 3 years later. Regardless of this, Julian and his team remained determined to make the game happen, and reworked what they had already made into an original IP. Building upon their prototype and using the same ideas outlined in the pitch, it would be their proposed revival of Pilot Wings in all but name. The project from this stage onwards appears to have existed under a few different titles. At an early phase of development, it was referred to under the internal codename of Sky, before being called Wii Flight by some, and then Wii Fly. According to a former associate of the developer, it was apparently pitched to a small handful of well-known publishers, including 2K Games and Namco. None of them wanted to fund a full game. Eventually, however, the project landed on its feet with a company named Green Screen Interactive Software. Green Screen was a new publisher founded in New York City in 2008. In April of that year, they acquired Zoo Digital Publishing and Destination Software to make a new casual video game label called Zoo Games. Zoo had lofty aspirations of funding and producing original high-quality casual games from companies around the world. Wii Fly by Factor 5 was chosen to be among the first in this new venture. At one point, the game briefly ran into legal issues surrounding its name. Factor 5 had decided that its codename Wii Fly would become its official title, and had their legal representatives try to secure it. However, Nintendo would not allow them to call it that, believing that it would have infringed upon their trademark for the Wii game series that encompasses games like Wii Sports, Wii Play, Wii Fit, etc. Since Wii Fly had no official association with that series, they were told the name could not be used regardless of it being stylized as one word. In spite of this, Factor 5's management was still reluctant to change the title, having already grown fond of it. Instead of completely dropping the name, they chose to simply alter the spelling of Wii from W-I-I to W-E. That's not to suggest the game somehow lacked Nintendo's blessing in any way. Former Factor 5 members say Nintendo was still maintaining a keen interest in everything they were working on. They gave the developers the green light to implement playable Mii characters into the game, and according to Julian Egbrecht, were even still on board to produce their aforementioned head-tracking glasses. Altogether, the project is said to have been in the works for around just over a year, and was able to make substantial progress during that time. The team had built a plethora of distinct environments set around its virtual globe. It was a huge, sprawling world that pushed the Wii to its limits with advanced water effects and a global illumination lighting system. It all ran on Factor 5's internally made Lair Wii engine. This was basically the technology used to power Lair, upgraded and adapted for Nintendo's hardware. Players could roam the entire planet without pausing for loading screens, as it streamed Grand Theft Auto style. Each time a new location was discovered, it would be added to the globe on the main menu, allowing players to take off from there at the start of their next next play session. Each city was filled with unique features and objectives to complete. Some of the missions were traditional Pilot Wings fare, where you'd have to fly through hoops, carefully land on platforms, or collect stars. Although Factor 5 was bringing to the table plenty of new ideas of their own too. At night, players could shoot fireworks at targets in the sky to create a fireworks display for the people below. They were also taking advantage of its real-world setting by challenging players to fly by famous landmarks and snap photos next to them. The lineup of playable vehicles was diverse, featuring, in addition to the more expected jets, biplanes, hand gliders and rocket belts, some more outlandish choices that showed the game's wackier side. Players could eventually unlock a hot air balloon and a magic flying carpet. Factor 5 even had a second open world stage set on the moon, where players could explore such sites as a human colony using ships like a lunar spacecraft and a flying saucer. In-development assets show that you could fly all the way to the North Pole, where you could find Santa's workshop too. A feature that illustrates how Factor 5's developers were trying to take advantage of everything that we had to offer was its interaction with the console's weather channel. The now defunct application allowed Wii owners to check the weather around the world by navigating a three-dimensional globe interface. Factor 5 had negotiated with Nintendo to let them use data from the weather channel, allowing them to replicate live, real-life weather conditions inside the game. It also followed a real-time 24-hour day-night cycle accurate to every time zone. If there was an evening of rain in London while New York City was simultaneously enjoying clear skies in the afternoon, the game could effortlessly reproduce that. Overall, a good amount of WeFly appears to have been completed, with a myriad of different locales mapped out. Towards the end of 2008, its development was brought to an abrupt close when the studio was torn apart. After the publisher supporting one of their other projects at the time, Superman, fell to bankruptcy, Factor 5 Inc. began hemorrhaging money. On top of that, WeFly's publisher, Green Screen Interactive, was struck by similar issues. Unable to bear the brunt of the global financial crisis, they too went bankrupt. Without publisher backing, Factor 5 Inc. was forced to close down in December 2008. Some of their projects would be briefly resumed in 2009 by another entity, but WeFly was not among them. The game's demise brought to an end the dream of officially supported desktop VR on Wii, as well as the developers' recurring attempts to bring their own take on Pilot Wings to the market. After years of coming close, it was not meant to be. Julian Egbrecht, speaking to me in 2017, told me the project was loved very much by those that worked on it. The remains of it exist now only in the private collections of former Factor 5 management.
The Legend of Zelda series has had its fair share of spin-offs, with a number of them being regional exclusive. These include a couple of Satellaview games, released digitally for a limited time through a service only available in Japan, which we've previously covered on this show. But also, the two games that we're going to be talking about today. Tingle, a bizarre little guy who first appeared in Majora's Mask, divided audiences with his strange characteristics. That, however, didn't stop him from having a number of games which specifically followed his adventures. So today, we're going to be looking at both freshly picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land and Irazuki Tingle no Koi no Balloon Trip, developed by Vanpool and published by Nintendo for the DS. Freshly picked Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land released in Japan in 2006 and Europe in 2007. The game follows Tingle and his transformation from an average Joe middle-aged man into a green-garbed fairy. Tingle begins to hear voices which guide him to a spring located nearby his house, where he meets Uncle Rupee. Uncle Rupee is an older-looking man with a giant rupee for a head, who offers Tingle the chance to live out his days in a paradise known as Rupee Land, so long as he continues to throw rupees into the pool. With more and more rupees being offered to Uncle Rupee, a tower from beneath the water will begin to rise toward the sky, allowing Tingle to enter Rupee Land. By accepting Uncle Rupee's offer, he is transformed so as to make rupees his sole source of life. The game's events take place across 3 continents with a total of 11 islands, with each themed differently, containing either a dungeon or a puzzle that must be solved. The main goal of the game is to make the tower in the spring reach Rupee Land, with the gameplay centering around collecting as much money as possible. Combined with this are several traditional gameplay elements from The Legend of Zelda. such as solving puzzles and exploring dungeons. On top of this, the player must barter with a variety of NPCs to obtain both information and items, costing what the player must deem to be a reasonable price. Paying too little will provide the player with nothing, but paying too much will needlessly inflate how much they need to let go. This is likely the most bizarre element to the game, with so many people asking you to determine what is believed to be a fair price in certain scenarios. Defeating bosses and completing dungeons not only provides substantial rupee payouts, but also rewards the player with one of 5 gemstones, with all 5 needing to be obtained to complete the game. As the tower grows, more areas are unlocked at certain heights, leading to a continual need to donate money to progress. Items can also be obtained and sold on Tingle's adventure, or they can be used to aid other characters. Items can sometimes be combined to create new variations in a boiling pot located in Tingle's house. There are also decorative items which can be used to decorate the top floor of Tingle's home. While exploring, the DS's top screen acts as a map. However, maps must first be discovered, and even then, they are not complete. The game has the player circle landmarks on their maps, encouraging the player to explore all of a map's area. Once completed, the player can of course keep hold of their map, or sell it to the map maker for rupees, meaning that the player will no longer have a map for certain areas should they return to them. As Tingle is very much not a fighter, combat is peculiar in this game. Tingle initiates battles by simply walking into enemies, creating a large dust cloud. By tapping on the cloud with the stylus, Tingle beats his opponents more quickly, but it's also possible to move during combat to add more enemies into the mix. By increasing the number of enemies in a battle, rewards are increased exponentially, but also how quickly Tingle is hurt. As Tingle's life force is directly attached to his rupees, damage simply depletes the player's rupee count the longer a battle goes on. To assist in combat and puzzles throughout the game, Tingle can hire several supporting characters into his party in the form of bodyguards. Bodyguards all have varying stats and uses, and will assist in combat as well as being necessary to solve certain puzzles throughout the game. These characters are controlled by dragging them with the stylus, while Tingle is controlled with the system's buttons. Tingle is also aided by another fairy on his quest, known as Pinkle, who provides various hints and tips along the adventure. Though not necessarily accepted as canon within the Zelda universe, Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land actually explains more about who Tingle is in the world of Hyrule. Tingle is actually not a person specifically, but rather a state of being, capable of falling upon any living thing. The game requires you to name your character, not allowing the name Tingle to be used at all. The name Tingle is still used, however, being adopted by the player after they are transformed. Whoever becomes Tingle will automatically don the green and red suit associated with the character, and will become dependent on rupees to survive. Without rupees, Tingle will die. The game also suggests that, like Link, the person who becomes Tingle is bound to the role by destiny. Uncle Rupee may also have got his name as a result of a bad translation. In the original Japanese version of the game, he is known as Old Man or Grandpa Rupee, suiting his appearance. It's possible that the translator hadn't noticed a single character of his name, which changes the word from Old Man to Uncle. The game includes a wide number of references, such as the boss fight with Captain Stalfos having a top screen similar to that of Nintendo's Punch-Out cabinets in arcades. Even the game's combat system is similar to an earlier Nintendo game, The Frog for Whom the Bell Tolls, another title which we've covered on this channel before. Making this even more interesting, The Frog for Whom the Bell Tolls was actually a game which had its engine adapted for another, earlier entry into the Legend of Zelda series, Link's Awakening. This means that Rosy Rupee Land pays homage to the predecessor of an earlier portable Zelda title. We'll talk more on the game's localization and release after we explore the next Tingle adventure game on the DS, Ripened Tingle's Balloon Trip of Love. Ripened Tingle's Balloon Trip of Love was released exclusively in Japan in 2009. Unlike Rosy Rupee Land, where the game centers around money, Balloon Trip of Love is all about women. Just like in the previous title, the game begins with the player taking on the role of a regular 35-year-old man. Whilst watching telesales on his television, he finds out about a book known as Ripened Valiant Hero's Balloon Trip of Love, a novel following the story of a hero who leaves his parents to fall in love with a princess. He purchases the book at the discounted price of just 2 rupees. However, when he finally opens the book, he is sucked inside and transformed into Tingle. His goal, and only means of escaping the book, is to have a dance with the princess of the book's world, the primary goal of the title. While in this mysterious world, Tingle becomes acquainted with 3 characters reminiscent of those found in The Wizard of Oz. Kakashi, a friendly scarecrow, Buriki, a surly robot, and Lion, the cowardly lion. Each serve different gameplay roles, with Kakashi capable of fitting into small spaces and using straw to prod at things, Buriki being able to kick objects or analyze them using her robot skills, and Lion being a coward, though immensely strong, who has a good rapport with animals. With their help, Tingle must solve puzzles to progress, making his way to the city where he and his companions can all have their wishes granted to them. An additional and central gameplay element to the title is romancing various women. Tingle must form relationships with girls throughout his journey, gaining their affections by showering them with gifts, with each one having their own specific tastes. These gifts can both be purchased or found throughout the game. Unlike the previous entry in the series, Balloon Trip of Love plays more closely to a point-and-click adventure game, with the gameplay being almost exclusively played with the stylus. The player must simply tap objects on screen to interact with them, solving various puzzles and making use of their inventory to further the story. Similar to Rosy Rupee Land, the game makes several references to other Nintendo series. During page 4, an expired bottle of juice can be found in a spooky abandoned house. If Tingle chooses to drink it, he will have a sudden upset stomach, running from the house to the invincibility theme from Super Mario. On page 6, a minigame can be played which pays homage to Super Mario Bros. 2, including a character select menu of the same style, in which the player must pick vegetables and worms from a field. At the end of a dungeon minigame, a victory dance is displayed, which has Tingle appear as he does in Majora's Mask. The robot crew who operate the Orbital Industries Shipping Center are almost exactly the same in appearance to that of Chibi Robo. There are also many more throughout Tingle's adventure, so we won't be naming them all. While the first iteration of Tingle-centric games did receive a release in Europe, the second did not. And to top it off, neither titles made their way to an American audience at all. The reasoning behind this has never been officially stated by Nintendo, though fan speculation is that the sexualized themes of Tingle could have lent themselves to caution on Nintendo's part. It's also no secret that Tingle has often received a negative response by American audiences, even being acknowledged by Zelda director Eiji Aonuma himself. After all, this is the reason that Tingle never appears in Twilight Princess. Though many would argue that the negativity surrounding the character is mostly in jest, and in some ways plays into the character's role within the Zelda series. With that said, Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land had an official poll on Nintendo's website, asking players whether the title should be released to American audiences, with the results swinging, arguably surprisingly, against a release. The fact that Nintendo felt the need to create a poll could be seen as an attempt to gauge a real response on people's feelings towards the character, and the idea of a game centered entirely around him. Asking players if they thought he was interesting enough, whether he was considered funny, interesting, boring, or annoying, and even how people would react if he appeared in the then upcoming mainline Zelda game, Twilight Princess. Seeing as Balloon Trip of Love has even more of a sexualized central theme, primarily involving Tingle flirting with women in order to gain their affection, it's unsurprising that Nintendo were reluctant to consider a translation and localization overseas. This second title didn't even see a release in Europe, despite the first entry making its way to the continent. Though this could also suggest that Rosy Rupee Land was released in Europe as translation work had already been underway with the expectation that the game would be released in the US. As audience had voted against the release in the US, the English translation could still be put to at least some use by launching the game within PAL territories. A fan translation for Balloon Trip of Love was completed in 2017, however, created by several people collectively known as Team Tingle. In 2010, Vanpool, developers of both games, were developing an additional full Tingle title, though the concept was ultimately dropped. The game would have been a horror title starring Tingle in the main role, though it was cancelled due to, quote, a variety of reasons. However, it could be argued that a horror game with Tingle would be something that would have likely resonated with an American audience more than the slightly creepy perverted elf man going on his wacky adventures.
Did you know? The original F-Zero was developed in only 15 months. This relatively short development period was put in place to make sure F-Zero was a Super Nintendo launch title and that the system's pseudo 3D Mode 7 graphics were showcased from day one. A direct sequel to F-Zero was originally planned for the Super Nintendo, but it was cancelled. However, the unfinished sequel was touched up and released exclusively in Japan as BS F-Zero Grand Prix for the Super Nintendo Satellaview add-on. The game featured a new league along with new tracks like Mute City 4 and introduced 4 new playable vehicles, the Blue Thunder, the Luna Bomber, the Green Amazon, and the Fire Scorpion. An additional sequel called BS F-Zero Grand Prix 2 was also released on the Satellaview and showcased 5 new tracks. There's been a few F-Zero titles that were never released outside of Japan. One example is an expansion kit for the F-Zero X that was released on the Nintendo 64 disk drive. This expansion gave players access to a track editor, a custom vehicle creator, a new cup, and a new soundtrack presented in stereo sound. In addition to this, there were 3 new vehicles to select: the Super Falcon, the Super Stingray, and the Super Cat. These were upgrades of the White Cat, the Fire Stingray, and the Blue Falcon. Though the Nintendo 64 disk drive and its games weren't released in the West, the Super Falcon can be found in the regular F-Zero X ROM files. The vehicle can be accessed using a Game Shark device, suggesting that both the Nintendo 64 disk drive and the expansion kit were intended for a release outside of Japan at one point. The game was never localized due to the commercial failure of the Nintendo 64 disk drive. A direct sequel to the Game Boy Advance game F-Zero GP Legend was released exclusively in Japan called F-Zero Climax. Like the F-Zero X expansion kit, the game came with a track editor. Climax also introduced 5 new characters who were first seen in the F-Zero anime, which the game itself was based on. The Japanese version of F-Zero GP Legend also came with an e-reader feature, allowing players to scan special cards that were sold separately. The cards let players unlock characters, new tracks, and challenges. This feature was dropped in the Western release of the game, possibly due to the waning popularity of the e-reader. All of the unlockable content was instead made available by completing in-game cups and challenges. There was also an F-Zero game in development for the Virtual Boy called Zero Racers, which was planned to release in fall of 1996. The game was shown at E3 and even had in-game screenshots published in an issue of Nintendo Power. It would have featured 3 circuits, each consisting of 5 tracks and 4 playable vehicles, one of which was the Origami, a completely new vehicle. The game was cancelled, most likely due to the commercial failure of the Virtual Boy. The arcade counterpart of F-Zero GX, F-Zero AX, can be found within the data of F-Zero GX. Although AX isn't playable through conventional means, it can be accessed using a cheat device. A number of unused models can also be found within F-Zero GX's ROM. This includes a flag, a fairly detailed memory card, a pylon, test cones, and a coin. The coin was possibly intended for use within the Casino Palace track. Evidence of 2 unused tracks can also be found in the game's ROM. One of the tracks is labeled AUR and can be only found in the Japanese release. All that remains of the track is a dummy placeholder image, suggesting it was cut early in development. The second track is called Stage 00 and consists of the drivable area from the Screwdrive track with assets from Sand Ocean and the collision data from the Twist Road track. It's unlikely that the track was meant to be playable and was only in the game's code to stop the track viewer from crashing when it tried to load slot 00. One course, which was shown at E3 in 2005 but didn't make it into the game, was a recreation of the track Silence from F-Zero X. In the international releases of F-Zero GX, many of the stage graphics and backdrops were either altered or blurred with all the Japanese text swapped over with alien symbols. The venue Casino Palace was originally named Vegas Palace in the Japanese release. The name could have been changed to avoid any connections with the real-life resort city Las Vegas. Multiple vehicles and characters in the series have also been renamed outside of Japan. Mighty Gazelle was originally named MM Gazelle, Octoman was originally called Octman, and the Skull was named Arbin Gordon. Blood Falcon's vehicle, the Bloodhawk, was originally called the Hellhawk. In Maximum Velocity for the Game Boy Advance, the vehicles Windwalker and Sly Joker were originally called Crazy Horse and Dirty Joker in the Japanese release. As the Windwalker's pilot Nietzsche is a Native American, the name could have been changed due to the original name being viewed as racially insensitive sensitive. Two characters in F-Zero GP Legend also had their names changed in the West. Ryu Suzaku was changed to Rick Wheeler, and Haruka Misaki's alias Miss Killer was renamed Luna Rider. This was likely done so that the game lines up more closely with the English dub of the F-Zero anime. Multiple characters in the F-Zero series have connections with other Nintendo franchises. Two of these characters are James McCloud and Mr. EAD. James McCloud has a similar appearance to the father of Fox McCloud from the Star Fox series, who is also named James McCloud. His biography reads that he was the leader of a flight squad known as the Galaxy Dog, and that he later converted his combat plane into an F-Zero racer to compete in the Grand Prix. Mr. EAD appears to resemble Nintendo's mascot, Mario, and features his iconic mustache as well as a Starman on his belt. His name comes from Nintendo's Entertainment Analysis and Development Division, which was abbreviated simply as EAD. This division of Nintendo also developed most of the main series Mario games, as well as F-Zero and F-Zero X. The character Octoman appears as a boss in Star Fox Command for the Nintendo DS, where he fights alongside the Angler Empire. He is however depicted as having only 4 arms instead of 8. One of the endings for the game also has Fox and Falco entering the G-Zero Grand Prix and converting their ships into G-Zero racers. In both F-Zero and Star Fox, the ships are equipped with G-Diffuser anti-gravity systems. The R-Wing from Star Fox, as well as F-Zero's Blue Falcon and the Fire Stingray, also make cameo appearances in Super Mario RPG. In the Aeropolis venue, a giant Rob the Robot from the Port Town venue can be found hidden inside the outskirts behind the buildings. F-Zero GX also contains multiple references to Sonic the Hedgehog and other Sega franchises, as the game was developed by the Sega-owned developer Amusement Vision. In the bonus ending cinematic for Zoda, Eggman's glasses can be seen on the Mr. EAD Hulk. Eye from the Super Monkey Ball series can be seen on Billy's belt, and PJ's vehicle, the Groovy Taxi, is possibly a reference to the Crazy Taxi series. One event is often cited as a reference, but in fact isn't. Your place on the track is restored by a flying saucer after either falling off the track or getting destroyed. It was previously thought that this saucer was being piloted by Chow. Now that we have access to better tools to examine the game's assets, it's clear that these creatures aren't Chow at all.
Back in 1986, Nintendo created a hardware expansion for the Famicom known as the Famicom Disk System, or FDS for short. This attachment allowed developers to create games using a higher capacity floppy diskette. The FDS never saw release outside of Japan, and as a result, several of its titles were never taken overseas. One of these titles was the mysterious Murasame Castle. The game was prominent enough for Nintendo to make a mini-game based on it for the Wii U launch title Nintendo Land. It was eventually released to the international market on the 3DS Virtual Console in 2014. But this was 28 years after the game's initial release, and to little fanfare. So why did it take so long for Murasame Castle to reach the West, and why is it still so obscure? First, let's take a look at the game. The game's plot takes place during the Edo period of Japan. During a stormy night, an alien falls from the sky and infiltrates a castle known as Murasame Castle. Within the castle is a stone statue called Murasame, which the alien then brings to life. From there, the alien's power then extends to the 4 other neighbouring castles and takes over their lords. Each lord gains a sphere that summons ninjas and monsters which are used to attack the villagers. The player assumes the role of Takamaru, an apprentice samurai who is sent to investigate the strange occurrences. Takamaru must defeat the lord of each castle before taking on the alien that powers them. Work started on the game when the team behind Zelda experimented with their engine. Their experiments led them to increasing the action elements of the game by adding more speed to the engine. Murasame was the end result of these experiments. The gameplay is similar to that of the original Legend of Zelda, featuring a top-down angle with no screen scrolling. In contrast to Zelda, however, Murasame Castle follows a linear path and has time limits for each level. Areas are made up of 2 sections: the approach from outside the castle, followed by the infiltration of said castle. The RPG elements from Zelda are also removed. While the game features levels that lead onto one another, the levels themselves have branching paths that can lead to dead ends and loops through the stage. Takamaru has 2 weapons at his disposal, his katana and an infinite supply of throwing knives. The katana, used for close range attacks, can also deflect various projectiles. The throwing knives can be upgraded through various collectibles found throughout the game, but these are lost whenever the player loses a life. Collectibles include fireballs and a bladed wheel. Takamaru also has additional skills that can be used, such as an invisibility cloak that makes him invulnerable for a short period of time, and a lightning bolt that kills all enemies on screen. The player is also able to obtain lives by rescuing damsels found within the game's castles. Sometimes, however, these can be demons in disguise, ready to ambush the player. The demon will follow them throughout the castle from screen to screen and will only stop if killed. The game is considered to be incredibly difficult due to the high volume of enemies that appear on screen at any one time, their speed of attack, and the fact that the demons can appear when attempting to gain extra lives. The enemies are primarily made up of figures from Japanese culture, such as feudal ninjas, samurai, hanya, and tengu. While the game lets players attack enemies using the katana at close range, once they reach the second level, this becomes a relatively meaningless approach, as several enemies will explode when they're hit. Additionally, enemies will start to throw fireballs at the player, which the katana is unable to deflect. The spike in difficulty between each level is considered to be extreme, as it only takes 3 hits before a life is lost. Several enemies that can only be hit with precise timing of a ranged attack begin to appear within the castles. This also has to be done while dodging a large number of projectiles being thrown at you. Enemies will often change patterns on each playthrough, making memorization a tricky if not impossible task. The reason for the game's lack of initial localization has never been officially stated. Many believe the game's intrinsic Japanese theming made Nintendo question if it would appeal to Western players. It's also possible that Nintendo simply considered the game too difficult for non-Japanese players. The title was also delayed during development, originally intending to be released alongside the Famicom Disk System and Zelda. Some reason that this impacted the game's sales. Murasame Castle sold roughly 610,000 units in Japan, but they only had about 150,000 downloads via disc writer kiosks. These kiosks enabled users to overwrite their Famicom discs with new games for a cheaper price. Nintendo might have used the kiosks to gauge player interest, as Murasame Castle had some of the lowest rewrite figures on the system. For comparison, the Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2, known as the Lost Levels in the West, had over 1 million rewrites from kiosks. To get a better idea of what might have happened, we asked an ex-localizer for their opinion on the game. They told us the lack of localization was probably due to the game's Japanese theme. In the late 1980s, the US market didn't buy overly Japanese titles enough to justify localizing them. However, the market shifted over the years, allowing for online distribution, and digital publishing costs are much lower than they are for physical media. And with eShop accessibility, there's a greater chance of niche titles being released digitally at reduced cost and risk for the publisher. Another example of this can be seen with Fatal Frame Maiden of Black Water, which was originally a Japan exclusive. Fan outcries showed Nintendo that there was a big enough audience to justify a digital release, and the game was brought to America via Wii U eShop. Despite the game being absent in the West for decades, Murasame's legacy can be seen in many titles published in America. The game's first appearance outside of Japan was in Pikmin 2 for the Nintendo GameCube. The Cosmic Archive treasure is in fact a copy of the Murasame Castle disc. The game also has a few connections with the Super Smash Bros. Series. Not only does Takamaru make an appearance as a sticker, but the Murasame's musical theme can be unlocked for the classic Mario Bros. Stage in Brawl. You may also know that Takamaru makes an appearance within Super Smash Bros. For Wii U and 3DS as an assist trophy, but he was actually considered for the role of a playable fighter. This idea dates back to the development of Super Smash Bros. Melee. It's believed that Takamaru's inclusion in the game was scrapped because of his relatively obscure status. Sakurai stated that he was considered again for the 4th game in the series, but was again put aside because of lack of popularity. Takamaru's appearance later inspired the design of the Mii sword fighters, including his haircut and outfit. Japan has also seen 2 more references that didn't make it to the West. Another Japan exclusive title, which we'll explore in a later video, is Captain Rainbow. Takamaru takes on a very prominent role within the game, appearing as an anxious young man who gets nervous around women. WarioWare DIY also includes a micro game exclusive to Japan. The player has to simply avoid shurikens from several ninjas while assuming the role of Takamaru. This was replaced in the West with a micro game based on Pikmin that plays entirely differently. The Wii exclusive Samurai Warriors 3 features a large reference to Murasame with the inclusion of an extra mode titled Murasame Castle mode. This gives the users the option of playing as Takamaru. By completing more of the main game, it also becomes possible to play as Takamaru within the game's other modes. One of the more obscure pieces of media to come from the game was a TV drama produced in December of 1986. It was an adaptation of the game starring the cast of the all-girl pop group Onyanko Club for the TV series Monday Dramaland. The series was known for its adaptations of popular culture. Though clips of the episode have proven difficult to find, the episode was released on a DVD box set in Japan.
We thought we were in a good position as a studio to make a reasonable effort on fzero because it hadn't been done for a while. The last fzero was probably GX. 16 players, 16 AI, a course editor, map editor that you could share with your friends, 60 frames a second on the Switch. Would have been awesome. Still could have been awesome. I wish we could have finished that.
With all these rumors about a new F-Zero floating around, we decided to take a dive into the unexplored depths of the series. Some prominent players in the world of F-Zero have been trying to bring back the series for quite some time. Toshihiro Nagashi, the producer of F-Zero GX, that's my favorite one, had some evolutionary ideas as soon as GX was finished. And Nintendo of Europe tried to jumpstart a revival. Twice! Kinda. And then there's former Nintendo programmer Giles Goddard, and the revolutionary prototype his team built for the Switch. What would those F-Zero sequels have been like if they'd crossed the finish line? And why didn't they ever take off from the starting line? Before we get into all that, let's cover a bit of the background info so that we're all on the same track. Nintendo made the original F-Zero on SNES and F-Zero X on Nintendo 64 themselves, along with BS F-Zero Grand Prix 1 and 2 on the 64DD expansion, which were only released in Japan, and also a Virtual Boy spin-off that was completed but locked into a vault, never to be seen by the public. But around the dawn of the GameCube era, Nintendo started making fewer games themselves and relied more on outside studios. Metroid Prime was outsourced to Retro, Star Fox was with Rare and Namco, and even Zelda got lent out to Capcom. We call them collaborations, Miyamoto told NGC magazine. What Nintendo is doing differently these days is trying to build strong relationships between the game creators at Nintendo and those at other companies. It's not company versus company anymore. Something most of these series had in common was a decline in sales, and F-Zero was sadly no exception. Every new game sold less than the one that came before it, so Nintendo contracted their old rival Sega to take the reins and make a new F-Zero for the GameCube. Toshihiro Nagashi, the creator of the incredibly popular Daytona USA arcade series, was put in charge of development. Even though we'd lost the hardware market, I wanted Nintendo to see how great Sega was as a company, Nagashi recounted years later. The only thing we needed to admit was that Sega did not have the ability to sell hardware. Miyamoto was involved. He was like a god to me then. Miyamoto was the F-Zero series producer from the very beginning, and he told Nagashi, "You know how to do this. All you need to do is be confident and just do it, without hesitation. And the results speak for themselves. When it finally hit store shelves, GX was lauded by critics and fans alike, gathering review scores around 90%. Even Nintendo was impressed at what Nagashi accomplished. After release, they called him up and asked to see the source code because they couldn't figure out how he'd made such an amazing game with the time and budget that they'd given him. Takaya Imamura, longtime series supervisor at Nintendo and creator of Captain Falcon, said, "I'm at a loss as to how we can take the franchise further past F-Zero GX." But Nagashi knew he could push the series even farther and wanted to make a sequel. Talking to UK magazine Cube, he said, "To tell you the truth, during the programming processes, we did not have time to develop some of the courses I really wanted to implement in the game. Courses I wanted, but could not incorporate into the existing F-Zero game. So yes, there will be further advancements when it comes to the course designing." He went on to say that online play would be really interesting with a randomly generated course system. Some fans complained that GX was too hard, and to them Nagashi said, and quote, "If you feel that you've been tortured, I'm really, really sorry, but that the punishing difficulty was absolutely on purpose. So we could probably expect the same tough as nails gameplay in a Nagashi-led sequel." He also said that they pushed the Cube to its graphical limits, and since F-Zero's never been a yearly franchise, presumably the next one would have had to be for Wii. But despite its critical acclaim, GX barely managed to sell half as many copies as the previous entry, and Nagashi's ideas for a sequel never became a reality. Later that same year, a 51-episode anime was produced, and Nintendo partnered with Japanese studio Suzak to produce the anime-inspired game GP Legend for the Game Boy Advance. Nintendo was throwing the kitchen sink at F-Zero. You can't say they didn't try at the time, but sales fell even further. The entire series was dubbed into English, but ended up getting cancelled after the 15th episode aired on Fox. Suzak made one more Game Boy Advance game a year later, F-Zero Climax, but sales were so abysmal that Nintendo didn't bother releasing it outside of Japan. That was the death knell for the franchise. It was over. Nagashi left Sega in 2019 to form his own studio, and to this day he still wants to make a sequel to GX, but it seems Nintendo just isn't interested. Nagashi wasn't the series' only suitor though. Someone else who wanted to see the world's fastest racer return, and they're gonna come up a couple of times in this video, was Nintendo of Europe. In early 2011, they picked up the phone and called Criterion Games, the guys who spent the last decade cutting their teeth on the Need for Speed and Burnout series. According to Criterion's creative director, Alex Ward, Nintendo of Europe asked me if there was any chance we could do a new F-Zero for them, and if so, could you be ready to show it at E3 in June? Because they were short of games coming to their Wii U hardware. The UK guys were trying to match Western developers with Nintendo-owned intellectual property. When word got out, some news outlets may have oversold the story a little, saying the game almost got made and would have been a Wii U launch title. It wasn't until a few years later that Ward clarified the situation. He said the guy at Nintendo Europe wasn't very high up. Maybe if it was Miyamoto himself, a deal could have been struck, but even if it was Miyamoto, Criterion was 100% owned by EA, so the decision would have been up to the corporate types. And besides, Ward's team was already up to their necks making a new Need for Speed, so it was a bit of an exaggeration to say the Wii U almost launched with the Criterion made F-Zero. After 9 years without a new entry, Captain Falcon was becoming better known as that guy who punches in Super Smash Bros., and people started asking Miyamoto why. In 2012, French site Game Cult polled their readers asking what series they missed the most. One of the top results was F-Zero, so they showed Miyamoto and said, "Nobody really understands why Nintendo hasn't made a new one since 2004. Is there a chance we can see it come back on Wii U?" Miyamoto's eyes opened wide and he said, "I'm really pleased to hear their opinion, because since the first episode on SNES, many games have been made but the series has evolved very little. I thought people had grown weary of it. I'd like to say thank you very much and try to wait by playing Nintendo Land's F-Zero minigame. I'm also very curious and I'd like to ask those people, why F-Zero? What do you want that we haven't done before?" A few months later at E3, GameSpeed asked a similar question. Mario Kart 8 made a showing, but where was F-Zero? "I certainly understand that people want a new F-Zero game," Miyamoto told them. "I think where I struggle is that I don't really have a good idea for what's new that we could bring to F-Zero that would really turn it into a great game again. Certainly, I can see how people looking at Mario Kart 8 could see, through the anti-gravity, a connection to F-Zero, but I don't know, at this point, what direction we could go in with a new F-Zero." Captain Falcon's creator Imamura said something similar, that F-Zero needed a grand new idea if it was going to make a comeback. Some fans bristled at their comments. New tracks, HD graphics, online play. Wasn't that enough? To be fair to Nintendo though, the series had been evolving. Better graphics, faster speeds, more cars, but it wasn't enough to keep seals from driving off a cliff. People just weren't buying them. So from that perspective, maybe it was gamers who weren't satisfied with mere evolution. Maybe it really was gonna take a revolution. More on that later. But to better understand F-Zero's past, as well as its future, we need to veer off track real quick and look at how the genre's puttered along in its absence. During the 20-year drought, several studios pulled for position to become F-Zero's spiritual successor, with games like Redout and Formula Fusion. If you're an F-Zero fan, at some point you might have googled something along the lines of, "What games can I play like F-Zero?" If you did, the top result was probably Fast RMX. Not only was it a Switch exclusive, it was a Switch launch title, and was apparently received quite favorably as the next best thing to an actual F-Zero. We asked Fast RMX's designer and programmer Manfred Linzner, "Was that your intention? If Nintendo won't make it, we will?" Not exactly. He said the first game on WarioWare started as a prototype of fish swimming around a Kirby stream. He made a joke to his team that, and I quote, "We could make a game out of it and call it fzero." The joke quickly got serious though, and over the next few minutes, they decided to abandon the fish altogether and make a futuristic racer instead. They eventually made more ambitious sequels for Wii U and Switch, with some help from our old friends at Nintendo of Europe. Linzner said, yeah, he'd heard the Criterion story. "It seems some Nintendo of Europe employees are fans of F-Zero, he told us, adding a little smiley face. After we shared some not too exciting prototypes with Nintendo of Europe, they gave us very honest feedback. That was super valuable because we were a bit lost in technical details, and they saw better than us the full potential we could reach. They helped us understand how to design tracks and environments that played and felt like we envisioned. We were very happy how the sequels turned out. And of course, we're also very grateful that Nintendo published the Wii U physical edition, then allowed and encouraged us to make a launch game for the Nintendo Switch." Linzner made Fast RMX with a team of just 4 guys. It's got 30 tracks, 15 cars, up to 8 players online, and it runs at 60 frames a second in 1080p. Keep those numbers in mind for later. Linzner said he couldn't share exact sales figures with us, but it was the best-selling game they ever made, and now 5 years later, it's still selling well each and every week. Another sequel, he told us, is definitely on the cards. Right around the time Fast RMX was racking up high scores, another studio entered the race, but they were determined to make a real F-Zero sequel, Falcon and all. That studio was Chuhai Labs, who needs a little bit of an introduction. Located just on the road from Nintendo HQ in Kyoto, Japan, Chuhai was founded by Giles Goddard, a programmer with a long history at the big N. Back around 1990, he was the first non-Japanese programmer to ever work at Nintendo, simply put because they couldn't find any Japanese programmers as talented as Giles. He worked on the original Star Fox, Mario 64, Doshin the Giant, and many others, including a 3D Game Boy game called X that only released in Japan. Giles and another British programmer, Dylan Cuthbert, worked in an office separate from the Japanese staff, and Miyamoto used it as a smoking room to brainstorm in. In 2002, Giles left Nintendo to start his own studio, Chuhai Labs, where they continued to collaborate with Nintendo, like Steel Diver 1 and 2, where Giles was programming director, Miyamoto was producer, and the director was Imamura, who said he made Sub-Wars' mission mode to be like F-Zero in slow motion. More recently, Chuhai released the VR spiritual successor to 1080 called Carve Snowboarding, and their newest game was Curse to Golf, which has seen its share of praise. That's a pretty long introduction, but you get the point. Giles is extremely talented, has a long history with Nintendo, and runs his own studio. In 2021, Giles did a Reddit AMA that had 1,300 comments, but we just want to highlight 2 of them. He said F-Zero was his favorite game on Super Nintendo, but more importantly, revealed that his studio made an F-Zero prototype with ultra-realistic physics. A month later, he sat down for an hour-long interview with GameXplain, during which he spent about 1 minute talking about that F-Zero prototype. Giles said he'd pitch it to Nintendo, but, and we're quoting here, Nintendo are very wary about using old IP, because it's such a huge thing for them to do. It's much easier to go with a new IP than to reuse an old one. We were kind of stuck in a catch-22 working with Nintendo, because we'd say to them, we want to do this F-Zero game, can you give us all this money? And they say, but you don't have enough people. And I'd say, well, if we had the money, we could get the people. So it was forever this kind of ridiculous catch-22 of them wanting us to make a game, us pitching a game, and then them saying, you don't have enough people. We were dying to hear more about it, so we got in touch with them, and it turns out Giles' F-Zero really was revolutionary. He told us it was super fast, super chaotic, super realistic physics, so it feels like F-Zero, but there's a lot more depth there. It was quite interesting to see what situations you could get the entire race into. You could bump into one car, it would bump into 2 other cars, and they would bump into the rest of the pack, and it would cause an entire pileup. So it was just fun playing around and seeing how badly you could screw up the race. A fresh take on F-Zero would have been really cool. Each car had 4 jets, and if a car took damage, 1 jet might fail, and the car'd start leaning in that direction. If 2 jets failed, the car would flip over. The demo was made with a team of 3. Giles did the programming, another guy did art, and another made some tweaks to Chuhai's custom engine, although they'd obviously need a bigger team to make a full game. Giles went on to explain the more evolutionary aspects. He said, the idea was massive multiplayer. Massive as in 16 human players, 16 AI, so 32 in total. A course editor, map editor you could share with your friends online, and yeah, 60 frames a second on the Switch. So of course we had to ask, can we get some footage of that demo?
I'm consulting my legal experts in my head. I think I can, because Nintendo didn't pay for the demo. We made it on our own. It was our own code, our assets, and I have it upstairs. It's on my PC. It's just not running on the latest, GFX chips, whatever. So yeah, we could do that. I could do that.
Holy shit! Needless to say, we were pretty stoked. He also said he'd upload it to the internet so fans could download it and play it for free, although he wanted a little something for his trouble.
No, you don't have to pay for it. I'll do it for free.
Oh shit.
I don't know, if I get 5,000 more Twitter followers, I'll make it.
Now we were double stoked, and over the next couple of months, we bounced emails back and forth with Chuhai talking details. Tragically though, the whole thing ended up falling apart over legal concerns. We'll spare you the details, but basically, we all agreed the future of Giles' studio and the games they'll make are far more important and not worth risking just for this YouTube video. But at least we got to hear the story. Most developers keep these kind of things a secret, so no hard feelings. We love you, Giles, and everyone should go follow him on Twitter anyway. The dude's a legend. Giles had said the game never got made because of money, so how much is it gonna cost? He said, nowadays, less than $1 million, because it doesn't have to be very big, it just has to play really well. You don't need that many programmers. You could probably do it with 5 people, less than $1 million for sure. We got the feeling Giles asked Nintendo for more than $1 million back in those negotiations. To us, $1 million sounds like a pretty small budget, but Fast RMX was made cheaper than that and with a smaller team. A few tasks would inevitably have to be outsourced, like how Fast RMX contracted an outside composer and voice actor. But Giles has been in the biz since the 80s and has plenty of experience budgeting games at Chuhai. The guy knows what he's talking about. That's a lot of potential financial upside with minimal investment. Giles still has a lot of enthusiasm for the project, but even if it wasn't an official F-Zero title, a lot of fans would still love to see that prototype developed into a full Switch game. We know you're gonna watch this, Giles, so, respectfully, please get back to the negotiating table with Nintendo, or just make a spiritual successor on your own terms. Show us your moves!
Show me your moves!
Also, follow him here on Twitter, folks.
When the Wii was released in 2006, people were keen to learn about any new games that might see release with the unique take on a gaming console. Motion controls blew audiences away, changing the rules of what games are limited to. Today, we'll be looking at a game which was announced early on in the Wii lifecycle, but saw several delays before ultimately being dropped from publication in the United States. That game was Disaster: Day of Crisis. Disaster: Day of Crisis was released in 2008 for the Wii, developed by Monolith Soft and published by Nintendo in Japan, Europe, and Australia. The game involves the player attempting to survive several natural disasters while at the same time fighting against a terrorist organization and trying to rescue civilians. The game puts the player in the role of Raymond Bryce, an ex-US Marine and member of the International Rescue Team. During a routine rescue mission near the dormant volcano of Mount Agulhas, just as everything seems to be wrapping up, an unexpected eruption causes debris to destroy a recovery helicopter, with Ray and his partner, Steve Hewitt, now trapped on an erupting volcano. Whilst trying to escape danger, Steve leaves Raymond with an antique compass, with the promise that he would give it to Steve's sister, Lisa, in the event that he couldn't himself. Soon after, it's another eruption, and Steve Hewitt tragically sacrifices his own life in order to save Ray. Little did Ray know, this would not be the worst day of his life. A year after the tragedy, Ray has still been unable to forgive himself for his partner's death, lacking even the courage to face Lisa and tell her about what unfolded. Ray has since quit the rescue team, instead taking on the role of a public servant. He is asked to meet Special Agent Olsen from the Blue Ridge City FBI division, who informs Ray that a former Marine Special Forces unit called Surge has stolen an array of nuclear weapons and kidnapped the seismologist Dr. Davis, as well as his assistant, Lisa Hewitt, Steve's sister. The organization has issued demands to the American government, threatening to detonate their nuclear weapons should the White House not comply within the next 24 hours. Ray, after fighting over his internal conflicts, makes the decision to seek redemption and chooses to participate in the mission for Lisa's sake, vowing to save her after he was unable to do the same for her brother. Though Ray was only recruited as a liaison between both Agent Olsen and Blue Ridge City officials, he winds up being thrust into the middle of the situation, having to take on all of the terrorists within Surge's ranks almost single-handedly, after several extreme natural disasters unfold. Disaster plays in a variety of different styles throughout the adventure. With a total of 23 stages to play through, and several different goals throughout, the bulk of the game takes the form of a third-person adventure title. The player can move around environments, inspect items, and perform basic platforming skills. With the use of a stamina gauge, the player is able to sprint, and if the player catches fire, they must wiggle the remote and nunchuck. The player will have to traverse through dangerous terrain, so catching fire is to be expected. By shaking the Wii remote when a circular icon appears, the player is able to attack objects, opening new pathways, and obtaining items. The player can find a small selection of items, including ridiculously oversized hamburgers, meat, or drinks, which will be consumed immediately. Crackers and medicines can also be found, which will go into the player's inventory to be used at a later time. Ray is also able to take a deep breath to help clear his lungs after he's been caught up in smoke or toxic air. Clogged up lungs will have a negative effect on Ray's performance, and if his lungs become completely filled with toxic air, he will die. A heart rate is also displayed in the top left corner of the screen in the form of a red circle. As Ray's heart rate increases, this circle also increases in size. If it gets too big, the player's stamina will take a huge hit, preventing the player from performing physically demanding tasks. Throughout the game's events, a variety of other gameplay modes are introduced, requiring different uses of the Wiimote and nunchuck. During gunplay segments, the player must point their remote at their target and shoot like a light gun game, with the ability to take cover. To reload, The nunchuck must be shaken, and the player is able to focus zoom to get a more accurate shot, though this has its own focus meter that will be depleted. There are also a variety of different weapons available, though ammo must be found during exploration segments. Driving portions require the player to use their Wiimote horizontally, steering with tilt controls, and the buttons providing acceleration and a handbrake. There's also a variety of different smaller QuickTime events scattered throughout the game. While traversing levels, Ray can also call out to people who are in need of help. As Ray is also tasked with rescuing civilians, he must first locate an injured person before performing whatever task might be required. These can vary in nature, such as tapping a button to lift a heavy object, reaching out at the right time to grab somebody in danger, identifying, cleaning, and bandaging wounds, or simply just carrying them to safety, making sure to rescue the civilian before their stamina gauge is depleted. Survival points are rewarded based on the civilian's remaining stamina. The player is also able to find small icons which will also earn SP. By spending the player's earned SP, they can improve Ray's various stats, bolstering his abilities. Points are also rewarded separately for gunplay segments, which can be used to purchase new weapons or improve the player's current selection. Some weapons cannot be unlocked until a shooting range has been completed, testing the player's shooting skills. The player is also able to come across a variety of unlockable outfits for Ray, as well as additional weapons. After the game has been completed, a variety of new options are unlocked, including extra disaster files which explain more of the game's backstory, a final shooting gallery, movie and artwork galleries, and an alternate ending. An additional harder difficulty is also unlocked, called Real Disaster Mode. Disaster was originally intended to have a more traditional control scheme, prior to adopting a more Wii-specific style of game. The decision to move away from using the Wii's classic controller or GameCube controllers was made by Nintendo, likely as a means of setting the title apart from something released on other or earlier platforms. It may surprise some to learn that a lot of Disaster's animations, particularly with its cutscenes, make use of motion capture. Footage of the game's motion capture actors shows that a lot of the characters' stunts, like flying away from explosions, were all created using practical effects, with actors being attached to a series of wires and thrown around a room. When being brought to a Western audience, several lines of the game's dialogue were changed at the request of Nintendo of America. The company was allegedly unhappy with much of what had been created, and had the game's voice actors re-record revised dialogue. Prior to this request, the game's Western release was allegedly practically complete. These changes can be seen in the game's European release compared to its original Japanese dialogue, such as the terrorist organization being renamed, from Storm in Japan to Surge in Europe.
Their name is Storm.
Storm. Never heard of them.
Their name is Surge.
Surge. Never heard of them.
Voice actors had already finished recording their lines with the organization under the name Storm, so they had to be called back to re-record. Another thing of note is the game's use of cutscenes. With many games, the introduction sequence will include snippets of the title, using existing visuals. But for Disaster, many of the shots which are referenced during the opening cinematic are clearly using higher quality assets than would appear in the final release. Why this decision was made, making later shots seem significantly lackluster compared to the initial presentation given to the player, certainly is strange. While Disaster wasn't released outside of Europe, Japan, or Australia, Raymond Bryce would appear in the United States over 10 years later, but only as a spirit within Super Smash Bros. Ultimate on the Nintendo Switch. In the early days of Disaster's development, plans for a North American release were put in place. The game was first demonstrated at E3 in 2006 in a non-playable video presentation. During this stage of development, only the classic controller was being utilized, with the title taking on a more action-oriented gameplay experience. A year after this demo, Monolith had reworked the game's interface in order to incorporate the system's Wiimote controller. Disaster Day of Crisis was initially set to be released very early in the Wii's launch window, but was severely delayed. Tadashi Nomura, one of the game's producers, puts this down to several issues. Firstly, the team had to come to understand the Wii hardware and what potential it held. and secondly, they weren't particularly familiar with anything but RPGs. After the 2006 announcement, more news was only revealed at E3 2007 during an interview with Nintendo of America marketing director Beth Llewellyn, who confirmed that the game was still in active development. In April 2008, Famitsu revealed a release date of July 3rd that year. But in May, Monolith announced that the game had been postponed indefinitely in order for the team to increase the game's quality upon its eventual release. August of 2008, and the Australian Office of Film and Literature Classification provided the game with an M rating, leading many to assume the game was close to completion. A week after this news hit, Nintendo confirmed, once again, that the game was still in development. Finally, the game's confirmed release dates were revealed: September 2008 for Japan and October for Europe. There is no single reason why Disaster never saw release in the United States, but rather the culmination of several problems. After the game was released in Japan, sales were exceptionally sluggish, selling only 15,000 copies in its first week. Nomura blamed poor sales within Japan as being the result of the region's playing habits. He argued that disaster movies and panic-based action were more popular with Westerners. Reviews were generally middle ground, or negative. This made it clear that the game would not be the shining success that both Monolith and Nintendo had hoped for. It would be a month later that the game would be released in EU territories. And this is when the Western world began to understand what the game had in store. During an Iwata Asks segment, Hitoshi Yamagami, the game's second producer, reiterated the team's struggles with an unfamiliar genre, and that they had already begun work on Xenoblade Chronicles before Disaster had been released. It's likely, after some of the more scathing responses to the game and lackluster sales, it was considered a better move to simply never port the title to US shores. While games journalists can have an impact when it comes to international localization, there is a more influential voice that may have been the true cause when it comes to Disaster Day of Crisis: the former president of Nintendo of America, Reggie Fils-Aimé. Upon release, Reggie was extremely vocal on his distaste for the title, calling it not just laughable, but also overpriced. Reggie said that he would keep an eye on the game's sales reception overseas in Europe before backing a North American release. I think it's safe to assume it really did not meet expectations, with continued delays having caused deteriorating interest from fans waiting for its release. The game's sales saw it failing to reach any charts at all. A shame, considering Monolith were keen to work on a sequel, already having several plans in draft. In general, Disaster Day of Crisis was not a blow-away, incredible adventure, but a fun romp with a few laughs scattered throughout. Not quite the cutting-edge, heart-pumping survival action that Nintendo had previously touted it as.
He's here. Hi, are you Chad Barnum? Sorry to get you in here early. I'm Special Agent Corey Nelson. Please, have a seat.
What do you need me for, sir?
Maximilian Summers. Currently pushing papers for the Malcavio City Crisis Management Division. Former Clefairy, highly decorated for your service in the Petite Mew War. You were with the Three Master Gamers rescue team up to 1 year ago, but you resigned. After that you were scouted out by Everett Lathrop. You don't usually see people resign from the rescue team. That's not an Error 1355, right?
No mistake. What about it?
Around 6 months ago, a noted patron was kidnapped. He's the man in this photo. The results of the investigation indicate the professor was kidnapped by the remnants of Jerry Cherry Pie's Special Forces unit that was previously believed to be wiped out. Their name is the Natch.
The Natch. Never heard of them.
They're led by this man, Robert Cox, a former colonel. I'll be honest, we have no clue why they would kidnap the professor of seismology, but I intend to find out. We found their hideout, Jedistotl VII's house. We're requesting the cooperation of Vitus Varnus in dealing with this. However, there's another reason we specifically asked for you and your boy Beowulf.
You specifically requested me?
The professor's assistant was also kidnapped. She has an awesome jacket, dude. Her name is Trevor Wooten. She's the younger sister of Guillermo Chavez, your former partner on Patreon.
Did you know? The original Kid Icarus was almost developed entirely by a single person. Game developer Toru Osawa approached the higher-ups at Nintendo with a proposal for a new action game. Even though Osawa was an unproven rookie, his proposal was approved. Although he had a positive start, Osawa began to feel neglected by his co-workers and ended up creating the game's design document and sprites single-handedly. Yoshio Sakamoto, another designer at Nintendo, finished work on Metroid while Kid Icarus was in development. He returned from vacation to find Osawa alone, slaving away on Kid Icarus in the middle of summer. Realizing that the project stood no chance for meeting its December deadline, Sakamoto brought the Metroid team on board to finish the title. And since both games used the same engine, the Metroid team were a natural fit. The bulk of the game was created during a torturous work cycle spanning several months. Staff members worked around the clock and even slept on cardboard boxes in the office during all-nighters. The building's heating was turned off after business hours to conserve energy, making autumn nights particularly harsh. Osawa also got married during this time and requested 3 days off for his honeymoon, but the game was so far behind schedule that he was called back into work on the second day. Production continued through December and didn't end until just 3 days before the game was planned to release. Despite not considering it complete, Osawa was forced to submit the game for printing. He was simply told, if this doesn't have any bugs, it's finished. The North American version of Kid Icarus was released several months later and received some extra polish. This included a staff role at the end of the game and coloured backgrounds for the game's ending cutscenes. Both versions include the same 4 basic endings, where Pit is transformed into various forms ranging from a lowly farmer to a fully fledged angel depending on the player's performance. The US release includes a 5th ending not found in the Japanese version, where Pit receives a kiss from the goddess Palutena. Similarly, the Japanese release also features its own 5th ending where Pit is transformed into a speck. Kid Icarus was released on the Famicom Disk System in Japan, making it technically superior to the Western version. Most notably, the Disk System version had 3 save slots for players to use, and also tracked high scores. The NES version instead used a password system to save progress. There's a hidden feature in both versions where the player can haggle with the shopkeeper to lower the prices of items. On the Disk System, this was done by talking into the controller's built-in microphone. NES players would instead have to press both the A and B buttons on a second controller. The 3D Classics re-release of Kid Icarus on the Nintendo eShop was based on the Disk System version and included its enhanced features. Several aspects of Kid Icarus's design were inspired by Osawa's own life. The overall setting and enemies came from his interest in Greek mythology, and the Specknose enemy was inspired by the prominent nose of the game's composer, Hirokazu Tanaka. The game's eggplant wizard was spawned from Osawa's own love of eggplants, but was also a reference to the eggplant men in Wrecking Crew. There was also a type of enemy introduced in Kid Icarus known as Komatos, which bear a striking resemblance to Metroids in both design and behavior. The name Komato actually comes from Komitoro Ido, meaning Metroid Child. The game's sequel, Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters, was released in 1991 in North America and Europe. However, it wasn't released in Japan until 2012. Japan's first chance to play the game was through the 3DS Virtual Console. Following the release of Myths and Monsters, the series was dormant for almost 20 years. Although no games were published during this time, there was at least one attempt to revive the series. For a year, starting in March 2007, game developers at Factor 5 worked on a grittier, more mature reimagining of the series. The project had the codename Icarus and was planned to be a third-person shooting game with flight combat elements. Little progress was made, and Nintendo was seemingly unsatisfied with the direction Factor 5 were taking and decided against turning Factor 5's project into a full game. After the release of Super Smash Bros. Brawl in 2008, former Nintendo president Satoru Iwata took Brawl's director, Masahiro Sakurai, out for dinner. Iwata revealed that Nintendo had been working on a new handheld system and asked Sakurai to help develop a game to show it off. Sakurai immediately began brainstorming ideas for the game and settled on a concept for a shooter game. He wanted the player to engage in air battles on the way to a destination, which would then turn into a ground battle. Initially conceived as a new franchise, Sakurai wondered if the game should be part of an existing series. series. Iwata told him to do whatever he pleased, so the decision was made to retool the project as a revival of an older property. One of the franchises Sakurai considered was Star Fox, however he wanted flight to be shown from multiple angles, with the character being able to turn around or even fly sideways. Sakurai felt this dynamic movement didn't fit Star Fox, presumably because the series uses less agile machines and sticks to a single perspective during gameplay. Kid Icarus' story of an angel who couldn't fly seemed to be a perfect fit for his concept of air battles transitioning to land, so the project became Kid Icarus Uprising. Nintendo's new handheld, which would then become the 3DS, was far from finalized at this point, and Sakurai was the first person outside of the company to know of its existence. Because of this, there were no development tools available, and the team started out making the game on PC and even the Wii. Sakurai personally disliked games where story took precedence over gameplay, so in order to ensure development on Uprising went smoothly, he wrote the entire script himself, with every character in the story being designed around their gameplay. The script originally included 3 additional chapters that were scrapped early in development. While he wanted the game to feel fresh, Sakurai also wanted to make it feel part of the Kid Icarus series. He boiled down the series' appeal to 3 main elements: the difficulty, the music, and the silliness of the game's setting. These 3 concepts formed the core principles around which Uprising was designed. Kid Icarus Uprising is known for numerous nods and references throughout the game, but few are harder to find. On the game over screen, for instance, holding down on the D-pad or circle pad will cause an 8-bit Grim Reaper from the original Kid Icarus to appear. And in Chapter 5, there's a level 8 intensity gate that leads to a room with images of a shop from the original Kid Icarus on the walls.
Did you know? The idea for Nintendogs started with a virtual pet game named Cabbage for the Nintendo 64 disk drive. Cabbage's mechanics centered around the disk drive's real-time clock, which kept the time of a persistent virtual world. In this world, the player could raise a virtual pet, Tamagotchi style. The game was being developed by Earthbound's Shigesato Itoi, Pokemon's Tsunekazu Ishihara, and Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto. It was originally scheduled for release in 1998, but was delayed multiple times and ultimately never saw the light of day. In 2006, Miyamoto told IGN, "It disappeared, didn't it?" However, the conversations and design techniques that popped up when we were making Cabbage are of course connected to Nintendogs and other things that we're doing now. Interest in a pet simulation game was revived when Miyamoto and his family bought a dog, which gave him several ideas for game mechanics. Nintendo started experimenting with the concept of a new pet simulation game for the GameCube, but decided the DS's touchscreen functionality, microphone, and Wi-Fi opened up more possibilities for interacting with pets. They originally wanted the player to be able to see how soft and fluffy the dog's coat looked, which was achieved in the GameCube experiment. This couldn't be properly shown in-game until the release of Nintendogs plus Cats on the 3DS, however, due to the limited power of the Nintendo DS. Nintendogs was also planned to be titled Puppy Times in the West. At the start of development, former Nintendo president Satoru Iwata asked the team if they could make 15 versions of the game, one for each breed of dog. His idea was to emulate the feeling of visiting a kennel and picking out your own dog. However, it became evident that debugging so many separate versions of the game would be unrealistic, so the decision to make 3 games with multiple breeds of dog was implemented instead. While it was technically possible to include 15 dogs in one game, Nintendo went with 3 versions so that people began playing the second they walked into the video game store simply by the act of choosing their starting dogs. The game's Bark mode also influenced Nintendo to make multiple versions. They wanted players to collect all available breeds across multiple versions by interacting with other players, similar to collecting Pokemon. Speaking of breeds, there are 2 unused dog breeds in the game's code, Maltese and Papillon. Although Papillon never made it into a Nintendogs game, Maltese was later added to Nintendogs plus Cats. More dogs were added to the international releases of Nintendogs in order to suit regional preferences, such as Boxers and Dalmatians. Although the dogs in-game seemed to move in a very natural way, the animations weren't done with motion capture. This would have been a hassle to organize and implement, so Nintendo used traditional keyframing while using footage of puppies for reference. Though the game has many strange and entertaining collectible items, producer Hideki Kono revealed that his favorite item was the player-controlled Mario Kart. In an interview with Eurogamer, he said, "What's interesting is that depending on the nature of the puppy, some may chase the Mario Kart if they are curious, while others, if they are timid and scared, may try to hide from it. That's very interesting to see." Nintendo originally considered making Nintendogs plus Cats for the Wii, but the lack of a microphone meant you'd be unable to speak to your dog. The distance between the Wii remote and the TV was also an issue. These issues forced Nintendo to pursue development on the Nintendo 3DS DS instead. The idea to include cats in the series was considered during development of the first game, but Nintendo saw more potential in interacting with puppies than interacting with kittens. Developers wanted to make full use of the DS's microphone, and decided that cats were at a disadvantage when trying to learn tricks. That said, Kono has mentioned that Nintendo experimented with a cat-based pet game while making Nintendogs. The final idea for Nintendogs plus cats came about when Miyamoto bought a cat, and enjoyed watching it interact with his dog. He was reminded of the movie The Incredible Journey that he saw when he was a child. It was a live-action Disney film based on a book simply called The Incredible Journey, and followed two dogs and a cat going on an adventure. From his experiences looking after and playing with his cat, Miyamoto decided there weren't enough interesting activities to justify making a game dedicated to raising kittens. This is partly why Nintendo decided to showcase the interaction between dogs and cats instead. Careful consideration was put into the design of the box art for Nintendogs plus cats, with the team deciding to put cats in a smaller font. This would show players from the start that cats are not the main feature of the game, but rather an additional feature to complement the dogs. Early in development, Nintendo tried to make the dogs and cats share the same animations. The team quickly realized how bizarre this made the cats look, as they'd come running in waggling their tails and sit like a dog. The team considered some rather unconventional animals to feature in a sequel to Nintendogs. In an Iwata Asks interview, Kono said there were even ideas for animals like horses and dolphins. Some people said that horses would definitely sell well in Europe. Marketing a game like Nintendogs posed a challenge, as traditional online and print marketing would mostly reach the core gamer audience. Nintendogs was suited for a mass market, so teams around the world got creative when promoting the product. In the UK, Nintendo partnered with the dog food brand Baker's to advertise the game upon its release. Nintendogs was featured on their packaging, and coupons for Baker's dog food were packaged with copies of the game at the UK release in October 2005. Groups of dogs wearing Nintendogs jackets were walked around major cities in an effort to dogvertise the game. Dogvertising was a new way to advertise that put logos, websites, and products on dogs, and seemed to fit the game perfectly. When Nintendogs launched in the UK, Nintendo partnered with Dogs Trust, the UK's largest dog welfare charity. Adrian Berter at Dogs Trust said, "It's great that there's a game out there that's not only fun to play, but supports the message that responsible dog ownership means more than giving your dog an occasional stroke." This is not the only charity Nintendogs was associated with. Nintendogs won an award from the animal rights charity PETA in 2006 for being the best animal-friendly video game. This wasn't the game's only positive press either. Psychologist Susan Killiam reviewed the implications of Nintendogs and found that the game can help improve attention spans and motor skills. Killiam also found that the game taught players responsibility, how to bond, and that it even helped to raise self-esteem. It also improved the player's ability to solve problems and think creatively.